My mother took my chair at Thanksgiving and called me a disappointment in front of everyone. She forgot the lights shining above her perfect dining table only stayed on because of me. When I slid a stack of past due utility records across her plate, the entire room went dead silent. Before I tell you how I plunged their picture-perfect holiday into total darkness, take a second to like and subscribe if you believe people should pay for their own mistakes. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. My name is Emily. I am 29 years old and I work as a billing analyst for a regional utility company in New England. It was Thanksgiving Day, and the snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, making the roads nearly impassable. I gripped the freezing steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan with white knuckles. In the passenger seat, strapped in with the seatbelt to keep it from sliding around, was a $120 catered turkey I had paid for myself. My phone buzzed against the center console. I glanced down and saw the text from my mother, Barbara. It read, "You are 5 minutes late. Emily, the turkey is going to be cold. Todd and Jessica are already here waiting." I let out a long, heavy breath that fogged the cold air in the car. I was driving 5 miles an hour on black ice to deliver the centerpiece of her holiday meal, and she was complaining about 5 minutes. That was my permanent role in the Jenkins family. I was the fixer. I was the reliable one. I was the daughter who handled the messy, unglamorous parts of life, so everyone else could pretend everything was absolutely perfect. If the roof leaked, I found the contractor and negotiated the price. If the grocery budget ran short, I quietly bought the extra provisions so my father would not complain. If my parents needed someone to drop everything and manage their daily crises, I was the one they called. And yet, the moment the crisis was averted, I was pushed right back into the shadows. I worked 50-hour weeks at the utility company, analyzing massive data sets and managing customer accounts. It was a good, stable job, but it was not flashy. In my family, if you were not flashy, you did not matter. The road curved and the grand houses of my parents' neighborhood came into view. These were sprawling colonial homes with manicured lawns and perfectly shoveled driveways. I pulled up to my parents' house. It looked exactly like a holiday greeting card. Every window blazed with warm yellow light. The front porch was decorated with expensive seasonal wreaths. Parked right in the middle of the driveway in the absolute best spot was a brand new white luxury SUV. That belonged to my older sister Jessica and her husband Todd. Todd was a real estate broker who loved to remind everyone how the market was booming for him. They had the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the absolute adoration of my mother. They were the golden couple. I had to park 2 blocks down the street because my mother did not want my old rusty sedan ruining the aesthetic of her driveway. I carried the massive roasting pan through the snow, feeling the freezing wind bite through my cheap winter coat. The aluminum pan burned my hands, but I kept walking. The entire way to the house, I thought about how many overtime shifts I had picked up this month just to afford the extra holiday expenses my mother had insisted were necessary. I pushed the heavy oak front door open with my shoulder. The house was suffocatingly warm and smelled of expensive pine candles. I kicked off my snow-covered boots and hauled the turkey toward the kitchen. From the living room, I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the loud, confident laughter of my brother-in-law, Todd. I walked into the kitchen and set the heavy pan on the granite island. My arms were trembling from the weight and the biting cold. Nobody came to help me. Nobody offered to take my coat. My mother, Barbara, walked into the kitchen holding a glass of expensive Chardonnay. She was wearing a silk blouse, and her hair was perfectly styled. She looked at the turkey and then looked at me with a deep sigh of disapproval. "You tracked snow onto the hardwood, Emily," she said, pointing at my wet socks. "And you are 15 minutes late now. Todd is starving." I rushed out to grab the catering order in a blizzard, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A thank you would be nice." Barbara rolled her eyes and took an elegant sip of her wine. "Oh, please, Emily, do not start with the drama today. It is Thanksgiving. Just put the turkey on the silver platter and bring it to the dining room." She turned and walked back out to her guests without another word. I stood there, staring at the turkey I had just spent a sizable chunk of my paycheck on. I could hear Jessica in the next room boasting about her upcoming winter trip to Aspen. Todd was talking over her, bragging about some massive commercial property deal he was allegedly closing next week. It was always a performance with them. A constant, endless parade of wealth and success that somehow always felt perfectly staged. I wiped my hands on a paper towel and transferred the heavy bird onto the silver platter. I carried it into the formal dining room. The table was breathtaking. Crystal wine glasses, polished silverware, and tall tapered candles burning brightly under the warm glow of the grand chandelier. The chandelier that I knew for a fact was drawing electricity paid for by my own bank account. I set the turkey down in the center of the table. The steam rose up, filling the room with the smell of roasted herbs. My father Thomas sat at the head of the table, smiling broadly at Todd. Jessica sat on his right, looking like she had just stepped out of a luxury catalog. "That looks acceptable," my mother said as she directed the guests to take their places. Everyone began pulling out their chairs, laughing and chatting. I walked over to the spot where I usually sat near the kitchen door, the spot where I could easily get up to fetch extra napkins or refill the gravy boat. It was the least desirable seat in the room, but it had always been mine. But as I reached for the back of the chair, a stranger stepped in front of me and pulled it out for himself. It was a man I had never seen before, wearing a sports coat and a smug smile. He did not even look at me as he sat down. I looked down at the table. I counted the fine china plates. I counted the crystal water goblets. There were 8 place settings. But there were 9 people in the room. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice low so as not to embarrass her. "There is no chair for me." I stood frozen at the edge of the formal dining room archway. The massive silver platter holding the roasted turkey suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the intense heat was radiating right through my oven mitts, searing my palms. I stared at the long mahogany table, my mind struggling to process the basic arithmetic sitting directly in front of me. There were 9 people currently gathered in the house. However, there were only 8 place settings arranged on the table. I counted 8 plates of my mother's prized vintage china. I counted 8 crystal water goblets, catching the light from the chandelier. I counted 8 heavy linen napkins folded into perfect, intricate swans. I looked toward the man currently occupying the chair nearest the kitchen door. He was a man I had never seen before in my life, wearing a tailored navy sports coat and already helping himself to a buttered dinner roll before the meal had even officially begun. He was my brother-in-law, Todd's younger brother, a guy who had apparently flown in from Chicago at the absolute last minute to crash our family holiday. More importantly, he was sitting in the exact spot I had occupied for the last decade. It was the spot closest to the kitchen door, so I could easily jump up and serve everyone else, clear the plates, and fetch the extra gravy while the rest of the family relaxed. No one had moved to make room for me. No one was fetching a folding chair from the basement to squeeze me in. My father Thomas was busy pouring a heavy splash of expensive Cabernet into the new guest glass, chuckling loudly at some joke I had missed. My sister Jessica was adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, completely oblivious to my presence. My arms began to shake violently from the sheer physical strain of holding the heavy bird. I cleared my throat, but the sound was completely swallowed by the loud, cheerful chatter filling the room. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I looked directly at Barbara, who was bustling around the wooden sideboard, adjusting a floral centerpiece that did not need adjusting. "Mom, there is no chair for me." Barbara turned around to face me. She did not look embarrassed. She did not gasp and apologize for a careless oversight. Her expression was completely flat and mildly irritated, like I was a retail customer, complaining about a minor inconvenience that she simply did not have the time to deal with. "Oh, right," she said, brushing her hands against her silk trousers. She walked right past me, completely ignoring the fact that I was physically trembling under the weight of the Thanksgiving centerpiece. I watched her glide into the kitchen, and I followed her, finally setting the massive turkey down on the granite island with a dull, heavy thud. My shoulders ached fiercely, and my lower back throbbed from the treacherous drive through the snow, but my mother did not ask if I was okay. I watched her open the lower pantry cabinet. She rummaged around in the back for a moment before pulling out a dark green plastic tray. It was the kind of cheap scratch tray you would find stacked in a high school cafeteria. It had a dull white water stain on the corner and a jagged piece of plastic missing from the side. She placed the plastic tray squarely on the kitchen island. Then she reached into the silverware drawer, pulled out a mismatched fork and knife, and set them on the scratched plastic surface along with a plain white paper napkin. Todd's brother decided to surprise him this morning. My mother set her tone brisk and entirely unapologetic. He is a guest, Emily. We obviously cannot ask a guest to eat in the kitchen. You can just fix yourself a plate and eat right here at the island. It is perfectly comfortable, and you will be closer to the oven anyway if anything needs to be kept warm. I stared blindly at the scratched green plastic. Through the wide archway, I could see the dining room table, gleaming beautifully under the chandelier. The contrast was so stark and so deliberate that it physically took my breath away. They were all going to sit on cushioned dining chairs, eating off gold-rimmed porcelain and drinking from fine crystal. I was being told to stand in the kitchen alone and eat off a piece of damaged plastic like a hired servant, taking a quick 15-minute break between clearing courses. "I am your daughter," I said. My voice was trembling, but it was no longer from the freezing cold outside. "I am your daughter, and I paid for that turkey. I drove through a severe New England blizzard to get it here. And you want me to eat in the kitchen alone?" Barbara sighed loudly and dramatically rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. I knew that specific sigh perfectly. It was the exact sound she made right before she decided to bulldoze whatever basic boundary I was trying to set. "Do not start this drama right now," she warned, her voice rising in pitch. I did not back down. My chest felt tight, with a heavy suffocating pressure building behind my ribs. "You invited 9 people to an 8-person table, Mom. You purposely did not set a place for me. You knew before I even walked through the front door that you were going to banish me to the kitchen." My mother stepped closer to me. The faint smell of her expensive department store perfume made me feel slightly nauseous. She looked me up and down, taking in my wet socks, my plain, practical winter sweater, my lack of a diamond ring, and my lack of a wealthy husband. Instead of keeping her voice down to keep our argument private, she deliberately raised it. She wanted the dining room to hear every single word. She wanted an audience to witness her put me firmly in my place. "You are single, Emily," she proclaimed, her voice ringing out crisp and clear over the ambient noise of the holiday party. The chatter in the dining room immediately ceased. "You are single. It is not like you have a husband to impress. Jessica and Todd are our priority guests. Todd's brother is family, which makes him a priority guest as well. They are building a life, Emily. They have social appearances to maintain. Who exactly are you trying to impress?" The words hung in the air, toxic and incredibly heavy. Priority guests. That was how she categorized her own children. Because Jessica had married a man who wore expensive tailored suits and drove a luxury vehicle, she was a priority. Because I worked a quiet, steady job as a billing analyst and lived a modest, responsible life, I was entirely expendable. My mother gestured vaguely toward the plastic tray on the kitchen island. "Stop being so sensitive. You are making everyone in there uncomfortable. Do not cause drama over a piece of furniture." I looked past my mother into the formal dining room. Every single person was staring at me. My father, Thomas, was looking down at his empty plate, intensely focused on the porcelain pattern. He was the man who was supposed to protect me. He was the man who was supposed to stand up and say that his daughter absolutely deserved a seat at his table. Instead, he reached for his wine glass, completely abandoning me to the wolves. He always chose the path of least resistance, and in this house, the path of least resistance always meant letting me take the fall. Then I looked at my older sister. Jessica was leaning back comfortably in her upholstered dining chair, swirling the red wine in her goblet. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my monthly car payment. She did not look sympathetic. She did not look embarrassed for our mother's horrific behavior. She looked highly amused. "Honestly," Emily Jessica called out from the dining room, her voice dripping with that patronizing syrupy tone she always used when she wanted to sound like the mature adult in the room. "You are acting completely unhinged right now. It is just a piece of wood. Mom is stressed out enough hosting this huge, complicated meal, and you are throwing a tantrum like a literal toddler. Just grab a plate and stop acting like a victim. It is embarrassing to watch." Todd chuckled softly, leaning over to whisper something to his brother. The new guest let out a low laugh, glancing in my direction with a smirk before looking away. "Stop acting like a victim." Those 5 words echoed in my mind, bouncing violently against the walls of my skull. I had spent my entire adult life making sure my parents and my sister never had to act like victims. I had balanced their budgets, negotiated their household repairs, and quietly subsidized their extravagant lifestyle so they could maintain this grand illusion of suburban perfection. I had sacrificed my own savings, my own peace, and my own dignity, all under the pathetic delusion that I was being a good daughter. While Jessica spent her 20s going to parties and dating wealthy men, I spent my 20s working overtime to cover the financial shortfalls our parents created. My single status was not a failure on my part. My single status was the direct result of spending every ounce of my energy keeping this ungrateful family afloat. I looked at the scratched plastic tray resting on the cold granite counter. I looked at the beautiful dining table that I was forbidden to join. I looked at the massive chandelier, casting a warm, expensive glow over my sister's perfect hair and my mother's smug, satisfied face. Something deep inside me shifted permanently. It was a very real physical sensation, like a heavy iron vault slamming shut and locking forever. The desperate, eager-to-please daughter who just wanted to belong finally died right there on the kitchen floor. She was instantly replaced by a woman who analyzed complex data for a living, a woman who understood ledgers, debits, credits, and the cold, hard reality of unpaid debts. They thought I was just complaining about a piece of wood and fabric. They thought I was hurt simply because I felt left out of a holiday meal. They did not realize that they had not just crossed a line. They had completely obliterated the foundation of our entire relationship. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the plastic tray across the room, even though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to tear the entire kitchen apart. I took a very slow, very deep breath. The freezing air from the blizzard outside still clung to my winter clothes, and I let that absolute coldness seep directly into my bones. I turned away from the kitchen island. I did not look at the plastic tray again. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of the heavy winter coat I was still wearing. My fingers wrapped around a thick, folded stack of papers I had retrieved from my mailbox earlier that morning. They were documents I had been holding on to all day, wondering if I should bring them up, wondering if I should ruin the holiday mood by demanding accountability. My mother watched me, her hands resting confidently on her hips, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully bullied me back into my designated corner, just like she always did. She expected me to pick up that mismatched fork load up a plate with whatever scraps were left and eat in silence while they enjoyed the feast I had provided. But I was entirely done eating their scraps. I was done being the invisible engine that powered their beautiful fake machine. I pulled the thick stack of papers from my pocket, gripping them tightly in my hand. The room was so incredibly quiet, I could clearly hear the winter wind howling against the frosted window panes. It was finally time to show them exactly what happens when you tell the person keeping the lights on that she does not deserve a seat in the room. I did not return to the kitchen island. I did not pick up the scratched plastic tray. For a long, silent moment, I just stood there, letting the roaring sound of my own realization wash over me. The deep, hollow ache that had burned in my chest for 29 years evaporated almost instantly. It was completely replaced by a profound, frigid clarity. I was a billing analyst. I spent my days looking at complex spreadsheets, tracing financial discrepancies, and correcting massive deficits. My entire family was a deficit. They were a black hole of unearned entitlement and endless demands. And it was finally time to balance the ledger. I turned around and walked slowly back into the formal dining room. My winter boots left wet, dark streaks against the pristine, polished hardwood floor, but I no longer cared about preserving my mother's immaculate house. Everyone at the massive mahogany table was watching me. Todd paused with his expensive wine glass hovering halfway to his mouth. Jessica narrowed her perfectly painted eyes, anticipating another argument she could easily win. My father Thomas looked profoundly uncomfortable, shifting his considerable weight in his heavy leather armchair. He refused to make eye contact with me. My mother Barbara let out a sharp, exasperated breath, crossing her arms tightly over her silk blouse. She was preparing to scold me again to remind me of my place in her strict social hierarchy in front of her assembled guests. I did not give her the chance to speak. I walked straight past the empty space where my chair should have been. I walked directly to the head of the table, where my mother sat ruling her domestic kingdom. Slung over my right shoulder was my heavy leather work purse. I unzipped the main compartment, reaching deep into the bottom. My fingers wrapped securely around a thick bundle of folded papers, held together by a heavy, thick rubber band. I always carried them with me, meaning to file them in my home office cabinet, but never quite finding the time to organize them. Today, they were my absolute salvation. I pulled the thick stack out and let it fall from my hand. The heavy bundle hit my mother's fine bone china plate with a loud resounding smack that echoed off the high ceilings. A few drops of dark red wine sloshed out of her crystal goblet and stained the pristine white linen tablecloth, spreading like a dark, ugly bruise. Barbara gasped violently, recoiling in her plush seat, as if I had just thrown a live, venomous snake onto her lap. "What on earth is wrong with you?" she hissed, grabbing a linen napkin to dab frantically at the spilled wine. She glared at the bundle of papers resting over her perfectly arranged holiday silverware. "What is this garbage, Emily?" I looked down at her. My voice was completely calm, entirely devoid of the desperation and neediness she was so accustomed to hearing from me. "Those are the past due utility notices," I said. "They are all addressed to Dad. The electric bills, the natural gas bills, the municipal water bills, the community trash collection fees, all of them printed on awful pink and yellow paper, stamped with bright red final notice warnings from before I took over the accounts. There are over 4 years of records sitting right there on your plate, Mom." The entire dining room went completely still. Even the sound of the brutal winter wind rattling the window panes outside seemed to fade away completely. Todd slowly lowered his expensive glass to the table, his confident smirk entirely vanishing. Jessica stopped fiddling with her diamond tennis bracelet, her mouth falling slightly open in genuine shock. My father Thomas went absolutely pale. The color drained from his weathered face so fast, he looked physically ill, staring in absolute horror at the documents bearing his name and his secret financial failures. I turned to look at the extended family, the aunts and uncles, and the unexpected brother-in-law who had casually taken my designated seat. For 5 years, I have intercepted these notices, I told the crowded room. My tone was level and precise, like a teacher explaining a simple mathematical equation to a room full of very slow students. For 5 years, I have quietly logged into my personal checking account every single month and paid the electricity that powers that massive crystal chandelier currently shining brightly above your heads. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the harsh reality of my words sink deep into their minds. I have paid the gas bill that is currently heating those expensive dual ovens to keep your side dishes perfectly warm. I have paid the water bill so you can flush the toilets and run the polished brass faucets in this massive, beautiful illusion of a house. Without my boring, unremarkable paycheck, this entire property would have been foreclosed on or sitting in total darkness, freezing in the winter years ago. I looked back down at my mother. Her mouth was hanging open, her eyes darting frantically around the table, trying to gauge the reactions of her stunned guests. The wealthy, successful facade she had spent decades meticulously cultivating was shattering in real time right over the Thanksgiving turkey. "You called me a disappointment, Mom." I continued, my voice steady and unwavering. "You banished me to the kitchen to eat off a piece of scratched, damaged plastic like a hired servant because I do not have a rich husband to impress you. You told everyone here that I am not a priority guest. But the absolute, undeniable truth is that this entire lifestyle is a total fantasy, heavily subsidized by my dull, boring 50-hour work weeks." Todd cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, attempting to salvage the deeply awkward situation. "Now, wait a minute, Emily." He started attempting to use his smooth, reassuring broker voice to calm me down. I cut him off immediately, turning my cold stare directly onto him. "Do not speak to me, Todd. You drive a leased luxury vehicle and wear expensive tailored suits, but your in-laws cannot keep their own lights on without relying heavily on my debit card. You are sitting at a table paid for by the exact same woman you just laughed at." Todd snapped his mouth shut, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. Jessica looked at him, expecting him to defend their honor, but he simply stared at his empty plate, completely humiliated, in front of his own brother and the rest of the family. I turned my attention back to my mother. She was staring at the thick stack of past due bills, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered uselessly over her lap. She could not formulate a single word to defend herself. The heavy, undeniable evidence of her profound financial incompetence was sitting right next to her mashed potatoes. I delivered the final blow with absolute precision, leaning in slightly so she could hear every single syllable clearly. "If I am not worth a seat at this table, you are not worth my paycheck. The auto-pay accounts are completely unlinked as of right now. I canceled the direct debits while I was standing in your kitchen listening to you insult me. Enjoy the turkey. I bought it." I did not wait for any sort of response. The silence in the dining room was absolute and devastating. It was thick, heavy, and completely suffocating. No one moved a muscle to stop me. No one spoke a single word of protest. My father kept his eyes glued to the white tablecloth, too deeply ashamed to look his guests or his oldest daughter in the face. Jessica stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that her perfect, comfortable holiday had just violently imploded. I turned around and walked out of the formal dining room, holding my head incredibly high. I grabbed my car keys from the wooden console table near the front door, deliberately leaving my heavy winter coat hanging in the hall closet. The freezing cold did not matter to me anymore. I pulled the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the brutal New England blizzard. The snow was falling much harder now, piling up in thick white drifts on the manicured brick walkway. I walked down the long winding driveway, past Jessica's pristine luxury SUV, and down the dark, quiet street to where my old rusty sedan was parked in the shadows. The freezing wind bit through my thin holiday sweater, but the pure adrenaline pumping rapidly through my veins kept me completely warm. For the first time in my entire adult life, I felt incredibly light and entirely free. I got into my car and locked the door securely. The engine sputtered slightly before roaring to life, the heater slowly pushing warm, dry air into the frozen cabin. As I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, letting the engine warm up, my phone began to vibrate violently in the center console cup holder. It buzzed continuously, a relentless, endless barrage of digital notifications. I glanced down at the bright glowing screen. There were furious, panicked text messages flooding in rapidly. Jessica demanded to know what was wrong with me and called me crazy. My father begged me to come back inside and talk about things reasonably. My mother threatened to disown me forever if I did not log back in and fix the utility accounts immediately. I ignored every single one of them. I reached over to turn off the device completely, ready to drive back to my quiet apartment and enjoy the rest of my holiday in total peace. But just as my thumb hovered over the power button, a final notification popped up at the very top of the screen. It was not a desperate text from my family. It was an automated priority fraud alert from my primary financial institution. The bold black text illuminated the dark, freezing cabin. Alert: unauthorized withdrawal of $60,000 processed from home equity line of credit. Please contact the fraud department immediately to verify this transaction. I stared at the glowing numbers as the freezing wind violently battered my windshield. My heart began to pound, a brand new, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I had just successfully severed my financial ties with my toxic parents, but the conflict had not ended. It had just escalated from terrible disrespect into outright devastating financial theft. The weekend following Thanksgiving was the quietest I had experienced in over a decade. Nobody knocked on my apartment door. Nobody demanded I come over to fix a leaky faucet or install a new smart thermostat. Nobody called me a disappointment. I spent Saturday and Sunday simply breathing, wrapping my mind around the fact that I had finally severed the parasitic cord, attaching me to my parents' extravagant suburban fantasy. But as Monday morning rolled around and I sat down at my dual monitors at the regional utility company, a profound sense of anticipation settled into my stomach. As a billing analyst, I understood the back-end architecture of automated municipal systems better than anyone. I knew exactly what was ticking away in the digital servers housed 2 floors below my desk. Early Friday morning, before the holiday weekend officially commenced for the corporate offices, I had logged into the employee portal. I submitted a formal relinquishment of financial liability for the property located in my parents' upscale neighborhood. By revoking my status as the primary guarantor, I systematically removed the protective shield that had kept their accounts active despite massive rolling deficits. For years, I had quietly absorbed their late fees, their peak usage surges, and their staggering winter heating costs. Without my linked debit card and my pristine credit profile attached to the ledger, the automated billing system immediately recognized the true state of Thomas and Barbara Jenkins' accounts. The raw numbers were catastrophic. There were thousands of dollars in hidden arrears, deferred maintenance penalties, and compounding interest that my mother had completely ignored while shopping for fine china. The system was entirely unforgiving. It did not care about my mother's social standing or my father's country club reputation. It only registered a massive unsecured debt. And municipal utility protocols dictate that when a high-balance account loses its guarantor standard shutoff procedures are initiated automatically the following business day. I spent my morning processing routine commercial audits, sipping lukewarm coffee, and watching the clock on my lower right monitor slowly tick toward the afternoon. The digital disconnection orders for residential sectors were typically dispatched in batches right around midday. At exactly 14 minutes past 2:00 in the afternoon, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against my wooden desk. The caller ID flashed a glossy, smiling photo of my mother, Barbara. It was a picture taken during a luxury cruise I had heavily subsidized 3 years prior. I let it ring. It stopped for a fraction of a second before immediately ringing again. Then came a text message, then another. The screen lit up in rapid succession, painting a vivid picture of a perfectly manicured suburban kingdom suddenly collapsing into the dark ages. Emily, pick up your phone right now. The power just went out in the middle of my favorite television program. I checked the breaker box and everything is fine. You need to call your people and get this fixed immediately. A minute later, another message arrived, the tone shifting from annoyance to genuine panic. The water pressure just dropped to a trickle. Emily, what did you do? Call me back this instant. I picked up the phone, swiped the screen, and placed the device to my ear. I did not say hello. What kind of childish stunt are you pulling? Emily, my mother shrieked through the receiver. Her voice was shrill, echoing with the unique kind of indignation reserved for people who have never faced a single consequence in their entire adult lives. The entire house is pitch black. The refrigerator is completely off. All the leftover turkey is going to spoil. I tried to turn on the faucet to wash my hands and nothing is coming out. You work there. Turn it back on right now. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair, keeping my voice perfectly level. I do not work in the field services department, Mom. I am a billing analyst, and as I clearly explained to you and Dad over the holiday table, I am no longer legally or financially responsible for your property. The municipal system simply processed your actual unpaid balances. Give me the phone, Barbara! My father's voice boomed in the background. A second later, Thomas was on the line, breathing heavily into the microphone. Emily, this has gone far enough. You made your little point on Thursday. You embarrassed us in front of Todd's brother, and you ruined a perfectly good dinner. We forgive you for the outburst, but you need to stop this nonsense. The temperature outside is dropping, and your mother is shivering. I stared at a complex spreadsheet on my left monitor, entirely unfazed by his attempted guilt trip. You are shivering because you have an unpaid natural gas bill that rivals a commercial warehouse dad. I am not punishing you. I am simply refusing to pay for a life you cannot afford. You have lived in a luxury bubble, funded by my sacrifices for 5 years. The bubble just popped. Bubble. The rage in my father's voice instantly morphed into a desperate, pathetic sort of begging. "Emily, please," he stammered, lowering his voice as if he was afraid the neighbors might somehow hear him through the walls of his freezing house. "You know we do not have the liquidity to clear those arrears right now. We are cash poor until the end of the quarter. Just log into your employee portal and put the accounts back under your name. We will pay you back, I promise." "You promised to pay me back for the roof repairs 2 years ago," I reminded him coldly. "You promised to pay me back when I covered the property taxes last winter. I am entirely done being your personal bank. If you need money to turn your lights back on, why do you not ask your priority guests for a loan? Jessica and Todd are right there with you." Todd and Jessica had decided to extend their Thanksgiving visit through the weekend, soaking up my parents' hospitality and drinking their expensive wine. They were currently trapped in that freezing dark house right alongside them. "I cannot ask Todd for money, Emily," my father hissed, sounding genuinely horrified by the mere suggestion. Todd is a highly successful real estate broker. It would be incredibly humiliating for him to know we are struggling with basic utilities. He is practically a millionaire. Then a millionaire should have absolutely no problem writing a simple check to keep his mother-in-law warm, I countered. "Put Todd on the phone." There was a muffled scuffle on the other end of the line. I heard my mother crying softly in the background, complaining about the rapidly dropping temperature in the grand foyer. Finally, a throat cleared, and Todd's slick, confident voice came through the speaker, though this time his signature arrogance sounded noticeably thin and strained. "Hey there, Emily," Todd said, forcing a casual chuckle that completely failed to land. "Listen, this is a really unfortunate misunderstanding. Your parents are in a bit of a tight spot. Be a good sister and just override the system for them. Families help each other out. If families help each other out, Todd, I suggest you pull out your pristine platinum credit card and call the utility company customer service line," I said. "The past due balance to restore electricity, gas, and water service is roughly $4,700. For a major real estate broker closing massive commercial deals like you were bragging about on Thursday, that should be pocket change." A suffocating dead silence stretched across the cellular connection. When Todd finally spoke, his voice was tight, defensive, and completely lacking its usual bombastic charm. "I would love to help Barbara and Thomas out." "Emily, truly I would." He stammered his words, stumbling over each other. "But all my liquid capital is currently tied up in a massive escrow account for a commercial acquisition. My funds are locked down tight by the financial regulators until the end of the month. My hands are completely tied. I literally cannot access my own wealth right now." I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer absurdity of his blatant lie. Tied up in escrow. It was the oldest, most pathetic excuse in the financial playbook. A man who bragged about buying luxury cars and cash was suddenly unable to float a few $1,000s to save his in-laws from freezing in the dark. The golden child had married a complete fraud, and my parents were too obsessed with the illusion of high society to demand actual proof of his success. They had drained my bank accounts for years to maintain a lifestyle that would impress a man who could not even afford to pay a basic heating bill. "I am sorry to hear about your temporary liquidity issues, Todd," I said, my tone dripping with icy, professional condescension. "But that sounds like a personal problem. Keep your coats on." "I hear it is going to snow again tonight." I pressed the red button on my screen, instantly disconnecting the call. I placed my phone face down on the polished wood of my desk, letting out a long, heavy sigh. The silence of my cubicle should have felt like a profound victory. I had finally drawn a massive, immovable boundary. I had forced them to face the ugly reality of their own financial incompetence. And yet my heart was still hammering a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. A deep, sickening dread pooled in the very bottom of my stomach, completely separate from the utility drama I had just orchestrated. The utility bills were just the surface. They were the visible symptom of a much deeper, more terrifying disease. Because while I had successfully cut off their access to my daily income, I could not stop thinking about the notification that had flashed across my phone on Thanksgiving night. It was the alert that had pushed this entire conflict from simple familial disrespect into the realm of severe federal crime. I pulled my phone back up and unlocked the screen, navigating directly to my secure banking application. I bypassed the standard login screens, using my biometric clearance, staring intensely at the secure inbox message that had been haunting me for 4 straight days. Alert: unauthorized withdrawal of $60,000 processed from home equity line of credit. $60,000. I owned a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet working-class suburb. I had scraped together the down payment over 6 grueling years of strict budgeting. I had painstakingly built equity in that small piece of property, viewing it as my only true sanctuary in a world where my family constantly demanded my resources. I had absolutely never applied for a home equity line of credit. I had never requested a loan. I had never authorized anyone to borrow against the very walls that kept me safe. And yet, a massive, staggering sum of money had been successfully extracted from my property. My parents' desperate demands for me to restore their power faded entirely from my mind. The utility bills were a distraction. The real battle was sitting right here on my glowing screen. Someone had completely bypassed strict financial security protocols, someone had provided detailed identity verification, and someone had walked away with enough stolen capital to ruin my credit and force my house into foreclosure. I looked at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was exactly 12:45 in the afternoon. My scheduled lunch break. I did not grab my usual packed salad from the break room refrigerator. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and my car keys. My parents were sitting in a freezing dark house learning the consequences of biting the hand that fed them, but I was about to walk into a far more dangerous arena. I left the corporate building and stepped out into the freezing, slush-covered parking lot. I started my car, turning the heater on high to combat the bitter chill in the air. I gripped the steering wheel and pointing my vehicle toward the main branch of my financial institution, located just 3 miles down the commercial parkway. I was a professional auditor. I spent my life tracking hidden funds and exposing corporate discrepancies. My family thought I was just a quiet, boring spinster they could easily manipulate in the shadows. They were about to discover exactly what happens when you steal from a woman who analyzes fraud for a living. The blast of artificial heat inside the bank lobby hit my frozen face the moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors. My boots left wet gray footprints on the polished tile floor. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly toward the glass-walled offices at the back of the branch. The sterile quiet of the building was a sharp contrast to the howling blizzard outside, but the storm inside my own chest was completely deafening. I caught the attention of a senior branch manager named Mr. Miller. He was an older man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard. He had helped me set up my initial mortgage several years ago when I first bought my home. I sat down in the leather chair across from his dark mahogany desk and slid my driver's license across the polished surface. I told him about the automated fraud alert I had received just 30 minutes prior regarding a $60,000 withdrawal. Mr. Miller adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and typed my information into his secure terminal. He asked me a series of standard identity verification questions. What is your mother's maiden name? What was the make and model of your first car? I answered them mechanically, my palms sweating profusely despite the dry heat blowing from the ceiling vents. He clicked his mouse a few times, and then his brow furrowed into a deep, troubled line. He turned his flat-screen monitor slightly toward me so I could see the digital ledger. Emily, he began, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. The alert you received is tied to a home equity line of credit that was opened against your primary residence. The total approved credit limit was $60,000. The entire available balance was fully drawn and dispersed 4 days ago on the Monday right before the Thanksgiving holiday. I sat perfectly still. My lungs suddenly forgot how to pull in oxygen. I stared at the bold black numbers glowing on the bright screen. $60,000. That house was my absolute sanctuary. It was a modest 3-bedroom property in a quiet working-class neighborhood, but it was mine. I had spent 6 brutal, grueling years scraping together the down payment. I had worked double shifts, negotiated every single utility bill, and eaten cheap pasta for months on end just to secure my independence. I had spent countless weekends covered in cheap white paint, fixing the baseboards and repairing the old plumbing myself. I had painstakingly built equity in those walls. It was my only true financial safety net in a world where my parents constantly drained my resources. I never applied for a loan, I told Mr. Miller, my voice sounding like it belonged to a complete stranger. I have never taken out a line of credit. I did not authorize any withdrawal. Mr. Miller looked at me with deep, genuine concern. He clicked another button on his computer mouse, pulling up a digitized folder of origination documents. If you did not authorize this, Emily, we have a very severe problem. These documents were submitted and approved through our remote lending portal. Someone provided extensive documentation to secure this credit line. He printed the file and handed the thick stack of papers across the desk. I took them with trembling fingers. The first page was the standard loan agreement. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page where the borrower was required to sign. There on the dotted line was my signature. At first glance, it looked surprisingly accurate. It had the same looping, cursive capital E that I always used. But as a billing analyst, I spent my entire career scrutinizing documents for subtle discrepancies. Looking closer, I could see that the signature was unnaturally stiff. It lacked the fluid, natural motion of my actual handwriting. It was a meticulous, heavily practiced forgery. I flipped to the second page, and the breath was violently knocked right out of my lungs. It was a durable power of attorney document. This specific legal form formally granted another individual complete absolute control over my financial assets, including the right to mortgage my property and execute legally binding credit agreements on my behalf. The name printed neatly on the designated proxy line was Thomas Jenkins, my father. The document featured a digital notary stamp from a public notary operating out of a small shipping store just 2 miles from my parents' pristine colonial home. My own father had orchestrated an elaborate, calculated scheme. He had physically procured a fraudulent power of attorney, forged my signature with terrifying precision, and used his biological relationship to me to convince a remote loan officer that he had the legal right to tap into my hard-earned equity. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a desperate split-second mistake made in a moment of panic. This was a premeditated, highly coordinated federal felony. My father had actively plotted to use my identity to secure cash he had absolutely no intention of paying back. "Mr. Miller," I said, struggling to keep the rising panic out of my throat. My father committed identity theft. He forged these documents. Where exactly did this money go? The alert said the funds were completely withdrawn. Mr. Miller typed rapidly on his keyboard, his expression turning grim. He understood the profound gravity of the situation. As a banking professional, he knew he was currently looking at a massive case of familial wire fraud. He pulled up the transaction history for the newly created credit account. Because the loan was originated online, we have the IP address logs for the portal logins, Miller explained, turning the screen back toward me. The entire application process, the document submission, and the final fund transfer were all executed from a single IP address. I recognized the internet service provider details immediately. It was the exact same static IP address registered to my parents' home network. The very same network I had personally configured for them 3 years ago when they complained their wireless signal was too weak to stream high-definition movies. The $60,000 was dispersed into an external account. Mr. Miller continued highlighting a specific transaction row. It was wired out to a checking account at a different banking institution. The destination account is listed under 2 names, Jessica and Todd. The names hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Jessica and Todd. My golden child older sister and her supposedly wealthy, highly successful real estate broker husband. I sat back in the leather chair, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping into place with horrifying clarity. For the past 6 months, Jessica and Todd had been aggressively flaunting a massive sudden upgrade in their lifestyle. They had unexpectedly rolled up to family dinners in a brand new, pristine white luxury SUV. Jessica had casually dropped into conversation that they had just purchased an exclusive tier membership at the Oakwood Country Club. They were constantly posting photographs of expensive weekend getaways and designer clothes. My parents had beamed with absolute pride, boasting to everyone at their church about how well their oldest daughter had married. But Todd was not closing massive commercial real estate deals. He was not a wildly successful broker pulling in heavy commissions. Todd was drowning. When my parents called me earlier that afternoon begging me to turn their electricity back on, my father had explicitly stated that he could not ask Todd for a loan. He had claimed it would be too humiliating to ask a millionaire for help, but that was a blatant, transparent lie. He could not ask Todd for money because Todd did not have any money. The truth was entirely devastating. Jessica and Todd were completely broke, living vastly beyond their means, deeply buried under a mountain of consumer debt. And instead of letting their golden daughter face the natural consequences of her own financial irresponsibility, my parents had chosen a different path. They had chosen to protect the illusion of Jessica's perfect wealthy life by sacrificing my actual real-life security. They had literally mortgaged my future to buy my sister a costume of success. My parents committed federal wire fraud to fund a luxury vehicle and a country club membership for a man who could not even afford his own rent. They had knowingly attached a massive $60,000 lien to my modest starter home. They knew perfectly well that I was single and relying entirely on a single income. They knew I did not have the flexible capital to absorb a monthly payment for a loan I never requested. Their plan was not just to borrow the money and slowly pay it back. I knew my mother and father. I knew their spending habits. I knew their complete inability to manage basic household utility bills without my constant intervention. They had absolutely no intention of servicing this debt. They were going to intentionally default on the loan. They were going to let the bank slowly accumulate massive interest charges and late penalties. They were going to sit back in their perfectly decorated colonial home and watch from a distance as my credit score was utterly destroyed. They intended to let the bank forcefully foreclose on my house, dragging me into total financial ruin, just so Jessica could keep taking pretty pictures next to a luxury car. They did not just view me as a convenient bank account. They viewed me as a completely disposable asset. Mr. Miller watched me process the staggering betrayal in total silence. He reached over and gently handed me a box of tissues, expecting me to break down. He expected me to cry, to weep over the horrific realization that my own parents had willingly sold me out. But the tears absolutely never came. The deep, profound sadness that had defined my entire relationship with my family was completely gone. I did not feel heartbroken anymore. I felt an incredible, terrifying focus. Every single analytical instinct I possessed as a professional auditor kicked into high gear. We need to place an immediate hard freeze on this credit line, I told Mr. Miller, my voice slicing through the quiet office with absolute authority. We need to officially flag this account for fraudulent activity. I want a certified copy of the IP logs, the transfer records, the forged power of attorney, and the origination signature. I need you to initiate a formal internal bank investigation immediately. Mr. Miller nodded quickly, his fingers already moving across the keyboard to lock down the compromised accounts. I will freeze everything right now, Emily. The funds have already left our institution, but I will alert the receiving bank regarding the fraudulent wire transfer. You need to contact the police. You need to file a formal criminal report for identity theft today. I took the thick stack of printed evidence and slid it carefully into my leather work purse. I am not going to the local police, I said, standing up from the leather chair. The local police will treat this as a simple family dispute. They will try to mediate a domestic conflict. This is a highly coordinated financial crime involving forged legal instruments and interstate wire transfers. I thanked Mr. Miller for his quick action and walked out of the bank. The blizzard outside had intensified, the wind howling fiercely across the empty parking lot, but I did not feel the cold. I climbed into my rusty 10-year-old sedan and placed my hands on the freezing steering wheel. My parents were sitting in a pitch-black freezing house right now, likely cursing my name and calling me a selfish, ungrateful daughter for turning off their power. They thought the utility blackout was the full extent of my anger. They thought they were dealing with the same compliant, eager-to-please girl they had manipulated for nearly 30 years. They had no idea that I had just discovered the $60,000 bomb they had planted under my life. I did not pull out my phone to call my mother. I did not text my father to scream at him for forging my signature. I did not demand an explanation from Jessica about her shiny new fraudulent car. Confronting them with emotions would only give them the opportunity to gaslight me, to twist the narrative, and to hide their remaining assets before the authorities could intervene. Instead, I pulled out my phone and scrolled past my toxic family group chat. I opened my professional contact list and scrolled down to a very specific name. I was calling a man named Arthur Sterling. He was a highly aggressive, no-nonsense financial fraud attorney who frequently contracted with my utility company to prosecute massive commercial embezzlement cases. He was ruthless, brilliant, and entirely immune to emotional manipulation. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring. My parents thought they could secretly destroy my life to keep up their pathetic suburban appearances. They were about to learn that the woman who balances the books always knows exactly how to collect a debt. The glass doors of the Sterling law firm were heavy and imposing, demanding real physical effort to push open. I stepped into a waiting area that smelled distinctly of polished mahogany and expensive bitter coffee. There were no warm, inviting colors here. There were no comforting landscape paintings or soft ambient music playing in the background. It was a rigid, structured space entirely designed for legal warfare, and that was exactly the environment I desperately needed. My appointment was for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At precisely 2 o'clock, a tall, sharp-featured man with piercing gray eyes walked out of the inner offices. Mr. Sterling did not offer a comforting, sympathetic smile. He did not offer empty platitudes about how difficult family matters could be. He simply shook my hand with a firm, practiced grip and led me into a massive conference room that overlooked the gray, snow-swept skyline of downtown Boston. I unzipped my leather work bag and laid the documents out on his massive glass table. I placed the forged-on loan agreement in the center. I set the fabricated power of attorney document right next to it. Finally, I presented the IP network logs I had secured from the bank manager, showing clearly that the fraudulent funds were extracted directly from my parents' home network. I spoke for 20 unbroken minutes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not allow my voice to waver. I laid out the exact timeline of the Thanksgiving holiday, the historical financial architecture of my parents' household, and the sudden devastating transfer of $60,000 into a joint checking account belonging exclusively to my sister Jessica and her husband Todd. Mr. Sterling listened in absolute total silence. He reviewed every single page with the meticulous, intense focus of a seasoned surgeon preparing to make a critical incision. When he finally looked up from the documents, his gray eyes were locked firmly onto mine. Your father committed federal wire fraud, identity theft, and severe bank fraud. He said, his voice carrying a calm, lethal certainty. He used his biological relationship to bypass the standard scrutiny a total stranger would normally face. He successfully weaponized your lifelong trust. I want my house completely safe, I replied, keeping my own voice perfectly steady. And I want them to answer for exactly what they did to me. My parents took out this home equity line of credit because they knew I am a single woman living on a modest salary. They knew I could never afford to pay the massive monthly interest on a $60,000 debt. They deliberately intended for me to lose my home to foreclosure. Mr. Sterling leaned back slowly in his heavy leather chair. They made a catastrophic miscalculation, Emily. They wrongly assumed you would act like a passive victim, but you are a corporate billing analyst. You track hidden numbers for a living. He immediately brought in his senior paralegal and a private investigator he kept on an exclusive retainer. The investigator was a quiet, unassuming man named Gregory, who specialized specifically in unearthing hidden financial liabilities and corporate ghosts. Mr. Sterling gave Gregory a single crystal-clear directive: Follow the money flowing into Todd's personal accounts. Find out exactly why a supposedly wealthy real estate broker desperately needed $60,000 stolen from his sister-in-law. The weekend passed in a state of hyper-focused, terrifying tension. I did not return my parents' frantic, relentless phone calls. The regional utility company kept their power completely shut off, and my mother left increasingly hysterical, dramatic voicemails complaining bitterly about the freezing temperatures in her pristine colonial home. I listened to her messages with a cup of hot tea in my hands, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow detachment. On Tuesday morning, Mr. Sterling called me back to his downtown office. When I sat down at the glass conference table, Gregory the investigator was already there, silently sliding a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder toward me. "Todd is not a successful real estate broker," Mr. Sterling said bluntly, entirely skipping any gentle preamble. "Todd is a financial phantom. He is completely drowning in high-interest debt and teetering on the absolute edge of total personal bankruptcy." I opened the heavy folder. The first page was a comprehensive, detailed summary of Todd's actual financial standing. The luxury white SUV sitting so proudly in my parents' driveway was not purchased with cash, as he loved to claim. It was leased at a staggering monthly rate that Todd was currently 3 full months behind on paying. The expensive, tailored suits, the lavish winter vacations to Aspen, the heavy pours of Cabernet at family dinners were all heavily funded by a toxic, suffocating web of maxed-out credit cards and high-risk personal loans. Gregory tapped a specific highlighted column on the printed financial report. Todd lost his real estate license in a neighboring state 4 years ago due to severe ethical violations involving the mishandling of client escrow funds. He moved to New England to completely reinvent his image. He has not successfully closed a single commercial property deal in 18 months. He currently owes over $120,000 to various incredibly aggressive creditors. I stared at the black and white numbers, feeling a cold, heavy wave of realization wash over my entire body. "Jessica has absolutely no idea," I whispered, thinking of my older sister's smug, arrogant face at the Thanksgiving table. "She firmly believes she married a self-made millionaire. She thinks she is living the ultimate wealthy dream." Mr. Sterling steepled his fingers, resting his elbows firmly on the glass table. "That is where the situation becomes truly disturbing, Emily. Because your parents absolutely know the truth." He instructed Gregory to show me the next critical page. It was a series of documented email exchanges and bank transfers obtained through the investigators' deep dive into the public court records and related civil suits filed actively against Todd. My father, Thomas, had been quietly bailing Todd out for over a solid year. There were verified records of Thomas systematically liquidating his own modest retirement accounts just to pay off Todd's most pressing immediate debts. The sickening, twisted truth clicked into place with horrifying, absolute precision. My parents had known for months that their golden son-in-law was a complete, absolute fraud. But instead of forcing Jessica to face the harsh reality, instead of letting the fake wealthy facade crumble, they actively chose to protect the illusion. My mother, Barbara, spent her entire life intensely obsessed with social standing. Her entire identity was permanently wrapped up in her pristine house, her exclusive country club memberships, and the wealthy, superior image of her favorite daughter. If the people at the local country club found out Jessica had married a broke, disgraced broker, it would entirely ruin my mother's carefully constructed social empire. "They ran out of their own money trying to hide his failures?" I said, my voice dropping to a hollow, raspy whisper as I traced the dates on the financial transfers. So, they decided to use mine instead. They forged my signature and put a massive, unpayable lien on my house just to pay Todd's angry creditors. They literally decided to sacrifice my home, my hard-earned credit, and my entire future just so Barbara could keep pretending her family was flawlessly wealthy. It was a betrayal so unbelievably deep and so incredibly callous that it temporarily stole my ability to breathe. They had not been conned by a smooth-talking grifter. They were active, willing participants in the con. They looked directly at my life, my modest starter home, my 50-hour work weeks, and decided I was entirely expendable. I was just a disposable battery they could easily drain to keep Jessica's artificial lights burning brightly. A hot, searing anger finally flared up in my chest, burning away the very last remaining traces of the loyal, eager-to-please daughter I used to be. The sadness was gone, replaced entirely by a craving for absolute, total destruction. "I want to call the police right now," I said, looking fiercely and directly at it. "At Mr. Sterling, I want to file a formal criminal report immediately. I want local detectives to walk up their perfectly shoveled driveway and put my father in tight metal handcuffs. I want them to pay heavily for this." Mr. Sterling held up a hand, his gray eyes perfectly calm and deeply calculating. "We will absolutely involve the criminal justice system, Emily. But if you call the local police right this very second, you will trigger a long, messy, sluggish, bureaucratic process. Local detectives will initially look at this as a messy domestic dispute. They will drag their feet. The bank will launch an internal investigation that could literally take months to fully conclude. In the meantime, your parents will realize they have been officially caught. They will have ample time to hire their own expensive defense attorney, and time to hide whatever is left of those stolen funds." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial level. "We do not want to give them time to prepare a defense. We want to trap them in a tight corner where they are absolutely forced to confess. We want them to completely destroy themselves, trying to desperately escape." I took a very deep, slow breath, forcing the burning anger down, forcing myself to think exactly like the professional financial analyst I was. "What is your strategy?" "We file a quiet civil injunction immediately," Mr. Sterling explained, outlining the legal maneuver with surgical, tactical precision. "I have already prepared the necessary legal documents. We will present the bank with irrefutable concrete proof of the forged signature and the fraudulent power of attorney. We will demand an immediate emergency freeze on the entire $60,000 line of credit. The bank will comply without hesitation because they do not want the massive liability of actively facilitating a federal crime." "But the money was already transferred to Jessica and Todd's joint checking account," I pointed out, gripping the hard edge of the table. "Exactly." Mr. Sterling smiled a sharp, incredibly dangerous smile. "We freeze the destination account as well. We use the fraud injunction to legally lock down the exact checking account where the stolen funds currently reside. Your parents and Todd will suddenly find themselves entirely cut off from that $60,000. They will not be able to withdraw a single penny to pay Todd's aggressive looming creditors." The sheer brilliance of the strategy washed over me. By freezing the funds quietly without a police raid, we would create an invisible, suffocating financial cage around them. "They are already completely desperate," I said, thinking of the frantic, panicked voicemails about their dark freezing house. Without my paycheck paying their utilities, they cannot afford their daily basic expenses. And now the $60,000 they stole to save Todd will be completely inaccessible to them. Precisely, Mr. Sterling said, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. "They will initially assume there has been a simple banking error. They will panic. The aggressive creditors will start calling Todd again, demanding their payments. Your parents will be heavily forced to demand that Todd produce the money they stole for him. The immense pressure inside that toxic family dynamic will build to an absolute boiling point. The golden child will demand answers from her husband. Your mother will demand answers from your father. The illusion of their perfect fake wealth will crack completely from the inside out. And then," what I asked, leaning into the plan, "and then they will get desperate enough to try and contact you to fix it," Sterling said. "They will try to manipulate you. They will invite you to speak with them in person. And when they do, you will calmly gather the final pieces of concrete evidence we need. We will let them weave their own inescapable noose. We will let them admit to the massive fraud on their own terms before we drop the final legal hammer." I looked down at the manila folder containing the absolute proof of my family's profound cruelty. I thought about my mother rolling her eyes at me in the kitchen, calling me a spinster, handing me a piece of scratched plastic to eat my holiday meal. I thought about my father silently sipping expensive wine while deliberately plotting to steal the roof from over my head. I thought about Jessica smirking at my plain, practical sweater while wearing clothes bought exclusively with my stolen equity. File the injunction. I said, my voice steady and completely resolute. Lock down every single account immediately. Let them freeze in the dark a little longer. Mr. Sterling nodded quickly, gathering the paperwork from the table. He tasked his senior paralegal with filing the emergency orders directly with the regional banking authorities right then and there. The trap was officially and permanently set. I left the law office and walked out into the cold, bustling streets of Boston. The winter snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a sharp, biting chill in the air that felt incredibly refreshing. I wrapped my heavy winter coat tighter around my shoulders, feeling a strange, entirely new sense of profound power settling deep into my bones. For 29 long years, I had been the reliable family fixer. I had managed their endless crises, smoothed over their reckless mistakes, and constantly protected them from the harsh consequences of their own actions. I was still going to fix this situation, but this time I was not going to repair their broken foundation. This time, I was going to systematically pull out the final support beams and let the entire corrupt structure collapse right on top of them. The silent investigation was completely finished. The financial borders were tightly sealed. Now all I had to do was sit back, watch the incredible pressure mount, and wait for them to make their next desperate, fatal mistake. It had been exactly 48 hours since Mr. Sterling filed the emergency injunction, sealing off the remaining balance of the fraudulent credit line. 48 hours of total radio silence on my end, while my parents sat in a freezing, dark house. I knew the pressure was mounting exponentially. I knew the creditors were circling Todd like starving sharks, sensing blood in the water. My absolute confirmation came on Wednesday evening in the form of a highly unusual voicemail from my mother. Her tone had shifted drastically from the shrieking rage of Monday afternoon to a sickly sweet, artificially soothing cadence that made my skin crawl. She suggested we meet for dinner to talk things over and clear the air like reasonable adults. She did not suggest the upscale Italian bistro downtown or the exclusive high-end steakhouse they typically frequented to show off their manufactured status. She suggested a faded neon-lit diner situated right off the local interstate highway. It was a place with sticky vinyl booths and cheap laminated menus that she would normally never allow herself to be seen entering. The profound lack of access to my bank account and the newly frozen stolen funds had instantly relegated my parents to the dollar menu. I parked my 10-year-old sedan under a flickering yellow street lamp in the cracked asphalt lot. The freezing rain from earlier in the afternoon had hardened into slick, dangerous sheets of black ice. Before I even unbuckled my seatbelt, I pulled out my cell phone. I navigated directly to the voice memo application and tested the internal microphone, ensuring it would pick up audio clearly from the inside of my heavy winter jacket pocket. I tapped the screen to begin recording, locked the display, and slipped the device deep into the thick wool lining. I took a slow, stabilizing breath. I was about to walk into a psychological minefield, but I was no longer the defenseless, eager-to-please daughter they expected. I was a professional auditor hunting for a confession. I pushed through the double glass doors of the diner, immediately greeted by the overwhelming smell of stale coffee and burnt frying oil. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow over the mostly empty restaurant. I spotted Thomas and Barbara immediately. They were sitting in a cramped corner booth, looking entirely out of place and deeply exhausted. My father wore a wrinkled, heavily creased sweater, his normally perfectly combed gray hair looking flat and unwashed. My mother sat directly across from him, clutching a thick ceramic coffee mug with both hands, as if she were desperately trying to absorb every single ounce of its heat into her freezing bones. They had not been able to run their hot water heater or their central furnace for 3 entire days. The beautiful, pristine colonial house they prized above all else had become a dark, freezing prison of their own making. I walked over and slid into the cold vinyl booth opposite them. Neither of them offered a hug or a warm greeting. Barbara offered a tight, strained smile, pushing a slightly stained menu across the table toward me. She launched directly into her rehearsed script, completely ignoring the massive, catastrophic elephant sitting heavily in the room. Emily. She began using her gentlest, most patronizing motherly voice. Your father and I have talked it over extensively. We want you to know that we forgive you for your little outburst on Thanksgiving. We know you work very long hours, and holiday stress can make people act completely out of character. We are willing to just sweep that entire ugly scene under the rug and move forward as a family. We just want things to go back to normal. I kept my face entirely blank, staring at her across the scuffed laminate table. She was graciously offering to forgive me for discovering that she had banished me from my own family dinner and treated me like a hired servant. She was deliberately playing the magnanimous matriarch, granting a generous pardon to her unruly, overly emotional child. I nodded slowly, dipping my chin just a fraction to let her think her classic manipulation was working flawlessly. Thank you, Mom, I murmured, keeping my voice incredibly soft and deliberately meek. I really appreciate that. I just felt so overwhelmed. My father leaned forward immediately, sensing what he firmly believed was emotional weakness. He rested his elbows heavily on the table, his eyes darting nervously around the diner to ensure none of the tired truck drivers or waitresses were listening to our conversation. Listen, Emily, he said, lowering his voice to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. We have a much more pressing, vital issue to discuss right now. There seems to be some sort of massive glitch with the regional banking system. Your mother and I went to transfer some necessary funds this morning to cover a few immediate professional obligations, and the accounts are completely locked down. The tellers are refusing to grant us access. I maintained my confused, innocent expression, tilting my head slightly, as if I was struggling to comprehend his words. Locked down? I asked, letting genuine-sounding concern filter into my tone. What do you mean, Dad? Which accounts are you talking about? I unlinked my personal checking account from your utility bills. I do not have access to your private finances. Barbara let out a sharp, hissing sigh, clearly losing her grip on the sweet, forgiving mother routine. The equity accounts, Emily, she snapped, her tone sharpening into a rigid demand. The funds we secured against the house. We need you to call the bank tomorrow morning and authorize the immediate release of those funds. Todd is expecting a massive wire transfer to finalize a highly critical commercial business deal, and the bank is telling us the routing is frozen due to suspected administrative irregularities. You need to call them and tell them everything is fine. I let my eyes widen, adopting a look of profound, naive confusion. I pressed my right hand against my chest, placing it directly over the pocket where my phone was silently recording every single damning syllable. The equity accounts, I asked, letting my voice tremble just perfectly enough to sound panicked. Mom, I do not understand what you are talking about. I never opened any equity accounts. I never took out a loan against my house. I do not have $60,000 to give to Todd. My father waved his hand dismissively, swatting away my frantic concern like it was a minor, annoying insect buzzing around his head. Do not be naive, Emily. We handled the complex paperwork for you to save you the administrative headache. We simply secured a $60,000 line of credit against your property. It is essentially just an early inheritance advance. You are a single woman living alone with zero major financial expenses. You have all that useless equity just sitting there, doing absolutely nothing productive. We simply utilized it to help your sister secure her future. You should frankly be honored to help Jessica and Todd build their wealth. An early inheritance advance. The sheer absolute audacity of the phrase echoed violently in my mind. They were actively framing a federal crime, a devastating identity theft, as a generous, thoughtful gift they had expertly orchestrated on my behalf. They had stolen my financial security, they had leveraged the only safe place I owned, and they were now aggressively demanding that I feel honored to be robbed. They truly believed that my entire existence was designed solely to serve as a financial shock absorber for Jessica. I leaned closer to this table, letting my shoulders slump forward, portraying the exact image of the obedient, deeply defeated daughter they expected to see. I needed to push him just a little bit further. I needed the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. But Dad, I stammered, keeping my tone perfectly submissive and deeply frightened. The bank manager called me. They said someone signed my actual name on the loan origination documents. They said a durable power of attorney was filed, granting someone else total control over my property. I did not sign those papers. How did the bank get my signature on a legal contract? I could get in huge trouble for this. I held my breath, entirely focused on the tiny microphone hidden inside my heavy coat pocket. I needed him to say it explicitly. I needed him to claim full ownership of the massive fraud without any room for ambiguity or future denial. Thomas scoffed loudly, shaking his head as if I was being incredibly dense and dramatically overreacting to a minor clerical error. He leaned directly across the table, invading my physical space, looking me dead in the eye with absolute chilling conviction. "I signed your name, Emily," he admitted, his voice dripping with absolute arrogant certainty. "I am your father. I have every moral right to manage our family assets to ensure everyone in this family is properly taken care of. I processed the legal proxy, and I signed the origination files because you were not using the equity anyway. It is just a minor technicality on a piece of paper. Families share their resources when times are tough. Now stop dragging your feet and call the fraud department tomorrow morning to clear this up. Tell them you authorized the proxy. They are holding our money hostage, and Todd needs that capital by Friday." There it was. The absolute, undeniable verbal confession of federal identity theft and wire fraud delivered with total casual arrogance over a plate of greasy, untouched diner food. He did not feel a single ounce of remorse. He genuinely believed that my life, my hard-earned property, and my very identity belonged entirely to him to distribute to his golden child as he saw fit. He actually expected me to call a federal bank investigator and lie to protect him from the consequences of his own severe felonies. I sat back against the cold vinyl booth, absorbing the total flawless success of my strategy. I did not need to scream at them. I did not need to explain how deeply they had betrayed me or cry about how little they valued my life. I had exactly what Mr. Sterling needed to utterly and completely destroy them. I looked at my mother, who was nodding along with my father, fully endorsing every single word he had just spoken. I looked at my father, who was glaring at me, expecting me to immediately submit to his authority and fix his mess. I offered my parents a very polite, very soft smile. It was the exact same smile I used when a corporate vendor tried to submit a fraudulent invoice. "Okay, Dad," I said quietly, standing up from the table and pulling my coat tightly around my shoulders. "I understand completely now. I see exactly what happened and why you did it. I will make sure the bank gets exactly what they need first thing tomorrow morning." My mother finally relaxed, letting out a long breath of relief. "Thank you, Emily," she said, her tone returning to that fake, sugary sweetness. "We knew you would do the right thing for your family. We will call you tomorrow when the funds clear." I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting in that depressing, freezing diner, waiting for a tired waitress to bring them a cheap meal they would likely struggle to pay for without my credit card. I stepped out into the freezing night air, the icy wind whipping across my face. I pulled my cell phone from my deep pocket. I stopped the recording, saved the incredibly damning audio file, and attached it directly to a secure email addressed to Mr. Sterling. I hit send as I walked to my car, a profound icy calm settling permanently over my soul. The trap was officially completely set, and they had walked right into it without a single second of hesitation. The deep freeze that settled over New England that Thursday morning was completely unrelenting. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, and the temperature had plummeted well below freezing, turning the accumulated snow into hard, dangerous sheets of solid ice. I sat at my desk in the regional utility company, holding a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, staring out the window at the frozen landscape. I felt an incredible sense of profound peace. It was the kind of absolute quiet that only comes when you finally stop trying to hold together a building that is actively trying to crush you. While I was sitting in my comfortable, heated office, reviewing commercial billing ledgers, a massive, invisible financial guillotine was dropping directly onto my parents' perfectly manicured suburban lives. When a major financial institution is presented with concrete verified evidence of identity theft and interstate wire fraud, they do not politely ask for a casual explanation. They act with swift, brutal, and absolute administrative force. First thing that morning, Mr. Sterling, my fraud attorney, had officially served the bank with the emergency injunction. He provided them with the undeniable proof of the forged signature, the fabricated power of attorney, and the specific internet protocol logs proving the crime originated from my parents' living room. The bank's response was immediate and catastrophic for my family. They instantly froze the $60,000 home equity line of credit. But the financial mechanisms of a fraud investigation do not just stop at the source account. The bank traced the original wire transfer directly to the destination routing number. They immediately flagged the joint checking account belonging to my sister Jessica and her supposedly wealthy husband Todd. Within a matter of hours, every single financial avenue my parents and my sister possessed was completely locked down, frozen tight by federal banking regulations, pending a full criminal inquiry. My parents were already trapped in a massive colonial house with absolutely no electricity, no central heating, and no running water. The indoor temperature was rapidly dropping into the low 40s. They were likely wearing heavy winter coats and thick gloves just to sit in their own living room. They had spent the last 3 days arrogantly assuming that I would eventually cave to their demands, that my lifelong conditioning as the obedient family scapegoat would force me to log into the utility portal and restore their services. They had blindly assumed that the $60,000 they stole from my home equity was sitting safely in Todd's account, ready to be utilized whenever they needed it. They thought they had successfully secured their golden child's wealthy lifestyle while leaving me holding the massive, suffocating bag of debt. But when my father, Thomas, drove his car down the icy street to a local branch, attempting to withdraw cash from his personal savings account to buy firewood and emergency supplies, he was met with a terrifying reality. The bank teller calmly informed him that his profile was flagged for severe fraudulent activity. His accounts were completely suspended. Furthermore, the bank representative issued a very stern verbal warning that the institution was actively reviewing his primary mortgage for immediate acceleration due to the breach of trust. My father left the bank in a state of absolute blind panic. He had no cash. He had no power. His perfect social reputation was teetering on the absolute edge of total public annihilation. He had absolutely no choice left but to turn to the only people he believed possessed liquid wealth. He drove his freezing car directly to the upscale luxury apartment complex, where Jessica and Todd rented their extravagant penthouse. My father marched up to their door, completely desperate, demanding the immediate return of the $60,000. He told them about the frozen accounts, the utility blackout, and the terrifying threats from the bank manager. He aggressively demanded that Todd write a certified check right that very second to clear the utility arrears and pay back the stolen home equity before the federal investigators knocked on his front door. That was the exact moment the flawless, glittering facade of the golden child's perfect marriage completely shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. Todd was entirely backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere left to hide. He could not print a certified check. He could not log into his mobile banking application to transfer the funds back to my father. His joint account with Jessica was completely locked down by the fraud injunction I had initiated. But even if the account had been active, the truth was far more devastating. Todd broke down right there in the entryway of the luxury apartment. The arrogant, slick-talking real estate broker persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, terrified man drowning in his own lies. He confessed everything to my father and to a completely horrified Jessica. The $60,000 was entirely gone. Todd had not invested the stolen capital into a massive commercial property deal. He had not placed the funds in a secure, high-yield escrow account. The very second that fraudulent wire transfer hit his checking account, he had systematically drained it to pay off an army of incredibly aggressive, high-interest creditors. He admitted that his real estate license had been suspended years ago. He confessed that the pristine white luxury SUV sitting in my parents' driveway on Thanksgiving was 3 months behind on its lease payments and was actively slated for immediate repossession. He admitted that the exclusive country club membership they flaunted to all of their friends was completely unpaid, and the club management had threatened to publicly post his debt to the entire membership board. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to private lenders who were threatening to ruin his life. The money my parents had committed a federal felony to steal from me was completely vaporized, instantly swallowed up by Todd's massive, insurmountable debts. Jessica stood in her expensive designer clothes, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the deception. Her entire identity, her absolute superiority over me, was entirely based on the illusion that she was wealthy, successful, and perfectly married. She had spent her entire adult life looking down on my practical sweater, my 10-year-old sedan, and my quiet 50-hour workweeks. She had firmly believed she was the ultimate winner of the family genetic lottery. Now she was staring at a husband who was a complete financial ghost and a father who was facing imminent federal prison time for stealing from his own daughter just to fund her fake existence. In a healthy, functional family, this devastating revelation would force a moment of profound internal reflection. Jessica should have directed her intense fury at the man who had lied to her for years. She should have been absolutely disgusted by her parents' willingness to commit felony identity theft to fund a superficial country club lifestyle. But toxic family dynamics do not simply vanish when confronted with the truth. They double down. Jessica possessed a deeply fragile ego that absolutely could not process the fact that she was married to a failure and raised by felons. Her reality required a villain, a scapegoat, someone else to carry the heavy, unbearable weight of her collapsing world. She needed it to be my fault. It was exactly 2:15 in the afternoon when my cell phone resting on my corporate desk began to detonate. The text messages poured in like rapid machine gun fire. The digital notification chime echoed through my quiet cubicle over and over again. I picked up the device and watched the venomous, hateful words scrolling across the bright screen. Jessica did not ask me for my side of the story. She did not ask me how I was coping with the fact that our parents had tried to steal my house. Instead, she unleashed a torrent of absolute concentrated vitriol. She accused me of being a miserable, jealous, bitter spinster. She claimed that I had intentionally manipulated the banking system to freeze their accounts simply because I could not stand to see her happy and successful. She typed massive block paragraphs declaring that I was a pathetic, lonely woman who was deliberately trying to destroy her marriage out of pure, unadulterated spite. "You are a toxic, selfish monster." "Emily," she wrote in one particularly long, aggressive message, "you could have just let Mom and Dad borrow the money. They were going to pay it back. But you just had to play the victim. You just had to ruin my life because no man will ever want you. You are dead to me. You are completely dead to this entire family." I sat in my ergonomic office chair, reading the digital barrage of insults. 10 years ago, those words would have completely destroyed me. I would have locked myself in a bathroom stall, crying until my eyes were swollen and red, desperately trying to figure out how to apologize and make things right. I would have internalized her venom and believed that I was truly a fundamental disappointment. But sitting there under the bright fluorescent office lights, holding my warm coffee, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I was looking at the desperate, flailing actions of a cornered animal. Jessica was attempting to use the exact same emotional manipulation our mother had utilized for decades, but she had absolutely no leverage left. She possessed no power over a woman who no longer desired a seat at their table. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph defending my actions. I did not try to explain the severe legal definition of wire fraud or identity theft. I did not waste a single second of my time pointing out the sheer absurdity of blaming the victim of a $60,000 robbery for the consequences of the crime. Instead, I minimized the messaging application. I opened the secure encrypted email portal on my cellular device and accessed the specific digital file my fraud attorney, Mr. Sterling, had sent me earlier that morning. It was the comprehensive background investigation report his private detective had compiled regarding Todd's hidden financial history. I scrolled directly to the fourth page of the verified legal document. It was a summary of public court records listing every single one of Todd's catastrophic financial failures. There were documented records of multiple personal bankruptcies filed in neighboring states. There were formal default judgments from aggressive private lenders. There was the official state board notification stripping him of his real estate license for extreme ethical misconduct and the mishandling of client funds. It was absolute, undeniable, black and white proof that the golden child's perfect husband was a complete and utter fraud. I took a very clear, high-resolution screenshot of that specific page, making absolutely sure that Todd's full legal name and the staggering sum of his defaulted debts were perfectly centered and legible on the screen. I navigated back to the messaging application, where Jessica was currently in the middle of typing another massive paragraph of hateful insults. The small digital typing bubble was bouncing actively on the screen as she formulated her next cruel attack. I attached the high-resolution screenshot of the bankruptcy records to the text thread. I did not add a single word of commentary. I did not include a snide remark, a warning, or an explanation. I let the raw, unfiltered truth speak entirely for itself. I pressed send. The image transmitted instantly, appearing at the very bottom of our long, toxic conversation. I stared at the screen, watching the digital typing bubble carefully. For 3 seconds, the little gray dots continued to bounce, indicating that Jessica was still furiously drafting her next insult. And then she saw the image. The typing bubble completely vanished. The relentless barrage of incoming text messages came to an absolute dead halt. The silence from her end of the digital connection was instant deafening and incredibly profound. It was the silence of an arrogant, fragile ego colliding at full speed with a solid brick wall of undeniable reality. She could no longer pretend that I was ruining her life out of jealousy. She had to sit in her expensive apartment looking at the concrete proof that her entire existence was a massive, humiliating lie built on the back of my stolen equity. I locked my cell phone and placed it gently back onto my wooden desk. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors in front of me, pulling up the next commercial utility ledger that required my professional analysis. My heartbeat was completely steady, my breathing perfectly slow and relaxed. The golden child had officially been squeezed. The illusion of my parents' wealthy, superior kingdom was completely crumbling into dust. They had nowhere left to turn, no money left to steal, and no scapegoat left to blame. But the consequences of their actions were far from over. The real legal hammer had not even begun to swing, and they were running rapidly out of time before the federal authorities demanded their pound of flesh. The slow, relentless grind of a corporate banking investigation is an incredibly beautiful thing to witness when you are sitting safely on the right side of the law. While my sister Jessica was busy spiraling into a pit of self-pity in her luxury apartment, the actual concrete consequences of my parents' actions were being hand-delivered directly to their freezing front porch. It was Thursday morning. The winter storm had finally broken, leaving behind a blindingly bright, painfully cold day. At precisely 10 o'clock, a bonded legal courier pulled a discreet, unmarked vehicle into the snow-covered driveway of my parents' pristine suburban home. Major financial institutions do not use standard mail services when dealing with severe internal breaches and active felony investigations. They require a verified physical signature to establish a documented chain of custody. My father, Thomas, opened his heavy oak front door, wearing a thick wool winter coat inside his own unheated house. He signed the courier's digital pad with stiff, freezing fingers and accepted a thick, sealed envelope. The document inside bore the stark, intimidating letterhead of the bank's primary national fraud division. I knew exactly what that letter said because my attorney, Mr. Sterling, had drafted the legal framework for the injunction that triggered it. The official notice informed Thomas and Barbara Jenkins that their newly opened $60,000 home equity line of credit had been permanently frozen due to verified evidence of identity theft, forged legal proxy, and fraudulent origination. The bank politely but firmly explained that they possessed the authenticated internet protocol logs proving the crime originated from my parents' specific residential network address. Then, the letter delivered the absolute devastating legal hammer. My parents were officially granted a strict 72-hour administrative window to completely return the dispersed funds in full. If the $60,000 was not deposited back into the institutional escrow account by the end of the business day on Monday, the bank would formally hand the entire case file over to federal prosecutors. The document clearly outlined the specific criminal statutes they had violated: interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud. It explicitly mentioned that these offenses carried mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. My father was a man who had spent his entire adult life desperately cultivating an image of flawless upper-middle-class respectability. He attended the right church, he shook the right hands, and he looked down his nose at anyone who did not meet his strict, superficial standards. The sudden, terrifying realization that he was entirely trapped and facing actual prison time completely shattered his fragile ego. He could not turn to his golden child for a bailout. Jessica and Todd were completely broke, their fake wealth exposed as a mountain of toxic consumer debt. He could not leverage his own home equity because his credit was already stretched to the absolute breaking point. He had absolutely no remaining avenues of escape. Except for me. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the phone on my corporate desk rang. It was the security desk located in the main lobby of my utility company office building. The receptionist sounded slightly alarmed, her voice tight with professional concern. She informed me that a man claiming to be my father was pacing aggressively near the front doors, demanding to see me immediately. She said he was acting erratically and refusing to leave the premises until I came down to speak with him. I did not panic. I did not feel the old familiar rush of anxiety that used to paralyze me whenever my father raised his voice. I simply took a slow, deep breath, saved the spreadsheet I was currently auditing, and locked my computer screen. "Please notify building security," I told the receptionist, my tone perfectly calm and entirely professional. "Ask an officer to stand by the reception desk. I will be down in exactly 3 minutes." I took my time walking to the elevator. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored work trousers and adjusted the collar of my blouse. For 29 years, my father had towered over me, dictating my worth and commanding my obedience. He expected me to rush down to the lobby, trembling with fear, ready to eagerly fix his catastrophic mistakes just to earn a tiny scrap of his approval. He was about to collide with a version of his daughter he had never met before. When the elevator doors parted on the ground floor, I stepped into the sprawling sunlit lobby. The corporate architecture was cold and imposing, featuring soaring glass walls and polished marble floors. Standing near the main reception desk, flanked by a very large uniformed security guard, was my father. The visual contrast between us was incredibly stark. I was perfectly composed, standing tall in my professional environment. Thomas looked completely unraveled. His heavy winter coat was buttoned unevenly. His face was flushed a dark, mottled red, and his hands were physically shaking as he clutched a crumpled copy of the bank notice. He looked like a desperate, cornered animal. "Emily," he barked, taking a sudden, aggressive step toward me. The security guard immediately shifted his weight, placing himself subtly between my father and me. I raised my hand, signaling the guard that I was perfectly fine. I stopped walking, keeping a safe, calculated distance of at least 6 feet between us. "You have absolutely 2 minutes to explain why you are disrupting my workplace, Dad," I said, my voice echoing clearly off the marble walls. "Make them count." Thomas stared at me, his jaw working furiously as he tried to reconcile the obedient daughter he remembered with the cold, imposing woman standing in front of him. He crumpled the bank letter in his fist and shook it in my direction. "You need to call your lawyers and stop this insanity right now, Emily," he demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and lingering arrogance. "I just received a highly threatening letter from the bank. They are talking about federal charges. They are talking about wire fraud. You cannot possibly allow them to do this to your own parents." I crossed my arms slowly, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "I did not initiate the federal charges, Dad. The banking institution initiated them because you committed a severe financial crime. You forged my signature on a legal contract. You fabricated a durable power of attorney. You stole $60,000 of my hard-earned equity to pay off the massive debts of a man who lies for a living. The bank is simply responding to your felonies. I did it for your sister, he pleaded, trying a completely different tactic. He lowered his voice, adopting a pathetic, begging tone. We were just trying to protect Jessica. Todd was in serious financial trouble, and we could not let her lose everything. We were going to pay the monthly interest, Emily. We were never going to let you lose your house. You have to believe me. You discussed intentionally defaulting on the loan in text messages. I reminded him, my tone dropping to an icy, lethal whisper. You literally planned to stop making the payments and force my house into foreclosure so you could quietly retire to Florida. Do not stand in my lobby and insult my intelligence by pretending you had any intention of protecting me. You threw me to the wolves to save a golden child who never once appreciated your sacrifices. Thomas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, completely ignoring the fact that his terrible plan had been entirely exposed. He was too consumed by the immediate, terrifying threat of prison to feel any genuine remorse for what he had done to me. Emily, please, he begged, stepping slightly closer. The security guard tensed, but I held my ground. We do not have $60,000. You know we do not have that kind of liquid capital. If we do not return the funds by Monday morning, they are going to hand the file over to the federal prosecutor. I could go to prison. Your mother could go to prison. You have to call the bank and officially accept the debt. Tell them you authorized the proxy. Tell them it was a massive administrative misunderstanding. He was actually asking me to commit perjury, to falsely confess to a crime I did not commit, and to voluntarily accept a crushing $60,000 financial burden just to save him from the consequences of his own calculated theft. Family does not send family to prison, Emily. He whispered, his eyes wide with desperate, frantic pleading. You cannot do this to us. I looked at this man who had spent his entire life making me feel incredibly small and profoundly worthless. I felt a deep, powerful surge of absolute clarity wash over my mind. You are entirely correct, Dad, I said softly. Family does not send family to prison, but family also does not forge signatures and steal homes. You stopped being my family the absolute second you signed my name on that fraudulent document. I uncrossed my arms and took one single deliberate step toward him. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the ultimatum I had been carefully preparing since the moment I walked out of his freezing dining room on Thanksgiving. I will call my fraud attorney, I said, my words landing like heavy stones on the marble floor. I will instruct him to contact the banking authorities and negotiate a settlement to drop the federal criminal charges. I will personally take over the $60,000 debt and satisfy the bank's demands before the Monday deadline. Thomas let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. His shoulders dropped and a faint shadow of his old, arrogant smile flickered across his face. He actually thought he had won. He genuinely believed that my lifelong conditioning had finally kicked in, and I was submitting to his authority one last time. Thank you, Emily, he breathed, reaching out as if to touch my shoulder. I promise we will figure out a way to pay you back slowly. We will make this right. I stepped back easily, avoiding his hand. The smile on my face was razor thin and completely devoid of any warmth. I am not finished, Dad, I said sharply, cutting off his premature celebration. I will only clear the debt and stop the federal prosecutors under one extremely specific, non-negotiable condition. Thomas frowned, his hand dropping back to his side. What condition? You and Mom own your pristine colonial house free and clear, I stated, reciting the financial facts I already knew perfectly well. You paid off the primary mortgage 7 years ago. The current market value of that property is well over $600,000. If you want me to absorb the massive fraudulent debt you created, you will compensate me for my financial risk and my profound emotional suffering. I held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. You and Mom will sign the deed of your house entirely over to me, I told him. You will execute a total legal transfer of the property into my name by tomorrow afternoon. You will surrender your entire estate to cover the stolen equity, the severe legal fees, and the massive breach of trust. If you sign the deed over, I will clear the bank fraud and let you walk away without criminal records." Thomas stared at me in absolute horrified silence. The blood that had briefly returned to his face drained away entirely, leaving his skin a sickly grayish white. He looked as though I had just physically struck him across the jaw with a heavy piece of timber. "Sign over the house," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "Are you completely out of your mind, Emily? That house is our entire life savings. That is our retirement asset. We spent 30 years building that property. We cannot just sign it over to you. Where would we live? What would we do?" "You will do exactly what you maliciously planned for me to do," I replied, my voice echoing with pure righteous justice. "You will figure it out. You can rent a small apartment. You can move into Jessica's spare bedroom since you love her so much. I absolutely do not care where you go, but those are my terms. You trade the house for your freedom." "This is extortion." Thomas sputtered, his anger suddenly returning, burning through the thick layer of his panic. "You are actively trying to steal our home. You are trying to ruin us." I laughed, a short, dry sound that held absolutely zero humor. "I am not stealing anything, Dad. I am offering you a perfectly legal business transaction to save you from a federal penitentiary. You have exactly 24 hours to make your decision. You can either walk into my attorney's office tomorrow at noon and sign the deed over to me, or you can stay in your freezing dark house and wait for the federal marshals to kick down your beautiful front door on Monday morning." I did not wait for his response. I turned around and walked purposefully back toward the secure elevator banks, leaving him standing entirely alone in the massive corporate lobby. Behind me, I heard Thomas erupt into a furious, incoherent rage. He cursed my name loudly, his voice echoing off the high glass ceilings. He called me a monster, a bitter, ungrateful child, and a ruthless thief. He yelled that he would absolutely never surrender his home to someone as vindictive and cruel as me. The security guard immediately stepped forward, firmly escorting my screaming father out the heavy revolving doors and into the freezing winter air. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor. I knew exactly what my father was thinking as he stormed out of my building. He firmly believed that my ultimatum was a bluff. He thought that because I had always been the quiet, compliant daughter, I would eventually break under the heavy pressure of public family disapproval. He was incredibly proud and hopelessly arrogant. He was going to reject my offer and attempt one final desperate maneuver to maintain his control over the narrative. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and my parents were scheduled to host their massive annual holiday party. They had already rented expensive industrial generators to keep the lights and the heat on, so their wealthy church friends and extended family members would not suspect they were completely ruined. My father honestly believed he could use that party to manipulate the entire extended family against me. He thought he could twist the story, paint me as an unstable, greedy villain, and use peer pressure to force me into dropping the charges without taking his house. He was planning to outsmart me by turning my own family into a weapon. He had absolutely no idea that I was already planning to attend that party. And I was bringing a leather-bound portfolio filled with enough undeniable concrete proof to burn his entire fake kingdom straight to the ground. The freezing air of Christmas Eve bit fiercely at my cheeks the absolute second I stepped out of the heated cabin of my old sedan. The pristine, manicured streets of my parents' affluent suburban neighborhood were buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of fresh white snow. The towering, ancient oak trees lining the wide sidewalks were draped heavily in expensive, twinkling holiday lights, casting a picture-perfect golden glow across the perfectly shoveled walkways. It looked exactly like a scene stolen directly from a high-end luxury greeting card. But as I walked steadily up the long, winding driveway, the grand illusion of holiday magic was immediately shattered by a low, aggressive mechanical rumble. It was the heavy industrial vibration of massive diesel engines. My father had actually done it. Thomas Jenkins, the man currently facing imminent federal prosecution for severe wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, had rented 2 massive commercial-grade generators to power his sprawling colonial estate. He had carefully tucked the enormous yellow machines behind the tall, evergreen hedges near the detached garage, desperately hoping the dense winter foliage would muffle their aggressive, deafening hum. Thick black industrial cables snaked across the frozen lawn, disappearing into the basement windows. The sheer, unadulterated vanity required to orchestrate this pathetic charade was absolutely staggering to witness in person. His bank accounts were frozen completely tight by a federal civil injunction. He was entirely locked out of the stolen $60,000 he had illegally leveraged against my modest starter home. He was staring directly down the terrifying barrel of a mandatory minimum prison sentence. He had literally been given a 72-hour ultimatum to surrender the deed to his house to me or face federal indictments. Yet his most pressing, terrifying priority was making sure the local country club members and his wealthy church congregation had warm hors d'oeuvres and perfectly chilled champagne for their Christmas Eve celebration. The icy street was lined closely with expensive luxury vehicles. I recognized the sleek black sedans belonging to the senior deacons of my parents' church. I saw the oversized imported SUVs belonging to Todd's extended family members who had flown in from the West Coast, completely oblivious to the fact that their golden boy relative was currently drowning in massive defaulted debt and multiple hidden bankruptcies. My parents were hosting a minimum of 70 prominent people inside that brightly lit house. They were throwing a lavish, glittering masquerade ball on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. In years past, I would have been inside that house since the break of dawn. I would have been wearing a stained practical apron, sweating profusely over the dual ovens, perfectly timing the expensive roast beef and the glazed carrots. I would have been entirely invisible, fetching clean plates and pouring fresh wine for wealthy guests who barely even knew my first name. I would have been the quiet, submissive spinster sister banished to the busy kitchen shadows, so Jessica could sparkle brightly in the center of the formal living room. I would have accepted the emotional scraps they threw my way, believing it was exactly what I deserved. But tonight, I was not wearing a practical wool sweater or comfortable, flat, sensible shoes. Tonight, I was wearing a stunning, floor-length crimson red dress that I had purchased specifically for this exact defining moment. It was tailored sharp and incredibly commanding, wrapping around me like a suit of modern armor. I wore tall black stilettos that clicked with absolute cold authority against the icy pavement. My hair was styled elegantly, falling in loose, confident waves over my shoulders. I felt an incredible surging wave of pure, unfiltered power coursing directly through my veins. For the first time in my entire 29 years of existence, I was not walking into that house, quietly asking for permission to belong. I was walking in to entirely conquer it. Clutched securely under my right arm was a thick, heavy leather-bound portfolio. It was not a purse or a festive holiday clutch. It was a terrifying weapon of mass financial destruction. Inside those pristine black leather covers rested the absolute, undeniable proof of my family's profound criminality. I had the forged loan origination documents bearing my heavily practiced false signature. I had the fabricated durable power of attorney formally stamped by the local shipping store notary. I had the certified network logs proving the federal wire fraud originated directly from the very living room I was about to enter. And I had the printed, verified court judgments detailing every single one of Todd's humiliating financial failures. It was a bomb waiting patiently to be detonated. I reached the heavy oak front door, which was beautifully decorated with a massive frosted pine wreath and an expensive velvet ribbon. I did not knock. I did not ring the polished brass doorbell. I simply reached out, turned the heavy handle, and pushed the door open. The wall of artificial generator-powered heat hit me instantly, carrying the rich, intoxicating sense of roasting meats, expensive imported cheeses, and fresh pine needles. The grand foyer was completely packed with beautifully dressed guests, holding crystal goblets and laughing loudly at polite, gentle holiday jokes. A professional string quartet was playing softly in the corner of the formal dining room, filling the warm air with elegant classical music. It was a masterpiece of suburban deception. As I stepped over the threshold and closed the heavy door behind me, the atmosphere in the immediate vicinity began to subtly, seamlessly shift. A few of my parents' affluent neighbors turned to look at the new arrival. I saw their eyes widen slightly, taking in the bold crimson dress and the intense, unwavering confidence radiating from my posture. They were completely accustomed to seeing me rushing frantically through the hallways with a heavy tray of dirty dishes, looking exhausted and defeated. They simply did not know how to process this new commanding version of Emily Jenkins. I offered them a polite, razor-thin smile and continued walking directly into the belly of the beast. I navigated smoothly through the crowded formal living room, my stilettos sinking slightly into the expensive imported Persian rugs. I spotted Todd first. The supposedly wealthy, highly successful real estate broker was standing near the lavish wet bar, gripping a glass of expensive scotch, so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was sweating profusely despite the comfortable room temperature. His eyes were darting frantically around the room, mapping the exits, constantly checking his phone. He looked exactly like a man who knew the authorities were rapidly closing in. Jessica was standing a few feet away, wearing a glittering emerald gown, but her signature arrogant smirk was completely absent. She looked pale, hollow, and deeply terrified. She was aggressively chewing on her lower lip, her eyes fixed blindly on the floor, completely ignoring the guests trying to speak to her. The golden child was finally experiencing the crushing, agonizing weight of absolute reality. I ignored them both. I was not here to play games with the pawns. I was here to completely corner the queen. I moved silently through the grand archway, leading into the massive, sunken family room. The towering stone fireplace was roaring with a massive, carefully arranged log fire, sending flickering shadows dancing across the vaulted ceiling. Standing directly in front of the hearth, basking luxuriously in the warm, glowing light, was my mother, Barbara. She was entirely in her element, holding court with a tight, intimate circle of 6 prominent women from her church congregation. These were the wealthy, deeply judgmental matriarchs who controlled the local social hierarchy. My mother was wearing her absolute finest pearl necklace and a tailored silver silk dress, holding a delicate glass of sparkling cider. She was speaking in a hushed, dramatic tone, performing the role of the tragic wounded mother with absolute theatrical perfection. I stopped walking, positioning myself just behind a tall marble pillar, entirely concealed from her direct line of sight, but close enough to hear every single venomous syllable leaving her mouth. I rested my hand gently against the cool stone, gripping my leather portfolio tightly against my side. I slowed my breathing, tuning out the classical music and focusing entirely on her voice. It has just been the most devastating, incredibly painful holiday season for Thomas and me, my mother whispered, pressing a manicured hand gracefully against her chest. She let out a soft, trembling sigh, expertly manufacturing a tear that glistened perfectly in the firelight. We are just completely heartbroken. We simply do not know what to do anymore to help her. Oh, Barbara, you poor dear. One of the older churchwomen cooed, reaching out to pat my mother's arm sympathetically. Her voice dripped with fake pious concern. We noticed Emily was not here tonight, helping with the catering. We were all wondering if she was sick. Is she doing all right, dear? My mother shook her head slowly, casting her eyes downward in a display of profound maternal sorrow. I wish it was just a simple cold, Martha, she said, her voice cracking with incredibly practiced emotion. The truth is, we are deeply terrified for her safety and her soul. Emily has suffered a complete sudden mental breakdown. It has been absolutely horrifying to watch our own daughter deteriorate so quickly. She has completely lost her grip on reality. I stood perfectly still behind the marble pillar, listening to the woman who had committed federal wire fraud against me completely rewrite history to protect her fragile, pathetic ego. She completely cut us off right before Thanksgiving. My mother continued wiping the fake tear away with a delicate lace handkerchief. She started screaming terrible, untrue things at the holiday table, making wild accusations against Todd and Jessica. She abandoned this family entirely without any warning or reason. Thomas and I have tried absolutely everything to reach out to her, to get her the professional psychiatric help she so clearly desperately needs. but she has become incredibly bitter and deeply paranoid. Barbara paused for dramatic effect, letting the church ladies lean in closer. She is making up these wildly impossible stories about us in her head, my mother whispered, her voice laced with tragic sorrow. She is claiming we stole things from her. She is threatening her own father. It is clearly a severe psychological break. We are just praying for her soul every single night. We are praying she finds her way back to the Lord and back to reality before she destroys her own life completely. The tight circle of churchwomen let out a collective gasp of profound sympathy. They shook their heads, murmuring quiet prayers and offering my mother their deepest condolences for having to endure such a tragic, heavy burden. They fully bought into the illusion, completely convinced that Barbara Jenkins was a saintly, long-suffering mother, dealing with an ungrateful, deeply unstable spinster daughter. They were fully prepared to ostracize me completely, to treat me like a tragic, cautionary tale of mental illness and familial abandonment. They were ready to validate every single lie my mother spun. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her performance, the absolute chilling ease with which she lied to the very people she claimed to respect, finally pushed me over the invisible line. The last remaining fragment of my childhood hesitation, the tiny voice that used to tell me to keep the peace, evaporated completely into the warm, festive air. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt a beautiful, radiant, absolute clarity. I held the power to shatter her entire universe, and the moment had finally arrived. I stepped out from behind the tall marble pillar, moving smoothly and gracefully into the bright, warm light of the roaring fireplace. My crimson dress caught the vibrant glow of the flames, instantly commanding the absolute attention of every single woman standing in that tight, judgmental circle. The soft murmurs of sympathy abruptly died in their throats as they turned to look at the woman they had just been fervently praying over. My mother's eyes locked onto mine, and the theatrical sorrow on her face was instantly obliterated by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained completely out of her perfectly powdered cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. Her mouth fell open, forming a silent, agonizing scream as she stared directly at the thick leather-bound portfolio tucked securely under my arm. She knew exactly what I was holding. She knew exactly what I was capable of doing right there in the middle of her precious party. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my perfect professional posture. I simply offered her a brilliantly polite, razor-sharp smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. I looked directly into my mother's panicked, terrified eyes, ensuring that every single woman in her precious church circle heard my words with crystal clear, absolute precision. That is a fascinating version of the truth, Mom. The absolute silence that fell over the sunken family room was so profound that I could actually hear the crackle and hiss of the expensive birch logs burning in the massive stone fireplace. My mother, Barbara, took a sudden, clumsy step backward. Her silver silk dress caught the firelight, but all the manufactured grace she possessed just seconds prior had completely evaporated. The circle of wealthy churchwomen simply stared at me, their eyes darting wildly between my stunning crimson dress and the thick black leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm. They were waiting for my mother to defend herself, to indignantly swat away my intrusion. But Barbara could not formulate a single, coherent syllable. She simply stood there, gasping for air, like a fish thrown violently onto dry land. Before anyone could break the heavy, suffocating tension, a loud, booming voice echoed across the grand foyer. My father, Thomas, had finally spotted me. He pushed his way roughly through the dense crowd of affluent guests, spilling several drinks and completely ignoring the startled gasps of his wealthy friends. His face was a deep, dangerous shade of purple, and the veins in his thick neck were visibly throbbing. He marched directly toward the sunken family room, pointing a thick, heavy finger squarely at my chest. "Get out of my house right this instant, Emily," he roared, his voice completely devoid of the polite, refined tone he usually reserved for his country club peers. "You are not welcome here. You are completely unstable, and I will not allow you to ruin this beautiful evening for your mother and our guests." He lunged forward, reaching out with his large hands to physically grab my shoulders and drag me toward the heavy oak front door. 10 years ago, I would have flinched. I would have instinctively, completely folded into myself and allowed him to physically dominate the space. But tonight, I did not move a single millimeter. I simply locked my eyes onto his and stood entirely firm in my tall black stilettos. "Do not even think about touching me, Dad," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that immediately stopped him dead in his tracks. He hovered just inches away from me, his hands suspended awkwardly in the warm, festive air, perfectly paralyzed by the unfamiliar, absolute certainty in my tone. I unzipped the heavy leather portfolio with a smooth, deliberate motion. The time for private warnings and silent financial maneuvers was entirely over. It was time for the public execution of the Jenkins family facade. I reached into the dark leather pocket and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of printed documents. I had spent the entire morning making premium, high-resolution color copies of every single piece of damning evidence Mr. Sterling had gathered. I did not hand the papers to my father. I turned directly toward Martha, the highly influential head of the church congregation who had just been praying so fervently for my troubled soul. I extended my hand and offered her the first staple-bound packet. "You were just praying for my mental health, Martha," I said, keeping my voice perfectly polite and deeply professional. "I think you should direct your prayers toward a completely different cause. Perhaps you should pray for a man who commits federal wire fraud against his own flesh and blood." Martha hesitated, her perfectly manicured hands fluttering nervously, but her insatiable suburban curiosity completely overrode her social manners. She took the packet. Several other church ladies crowded tightly around her, peering over her cashmere shoulders to see the glossy printed pages. I pulled out a second thick packet and handed it directly to a tall, distinguished man standing near the edge of the circle. He was a senior board member at the exclusive local country club, the exact same club where Todd had recently acquired his wildly expensive unpaid membership. "That is a certified copy of a $60,000 home equity line of credit," I announced, my voice projecting clearly across the suddenly completely silent room. The entire party had stopped drinking, stopped laughing, and stopped pretending. Every single guest was entirely focused on the horrific drama unfolding by the fireplace. The signature at the bottom of that loan agreement is a highly practiced, meticulous forgery. The durable power of attorney attached to the second page is a complete fabrication stamped by a fraudulent notary. My father, Thomas Jenkins, explicitly committed identity theft to illegally mortgage my modest starter home. He stole my hard-earned equity because he desperately needed cash to cover up a massive, humiliating secret. My father let out a loud, desperate sputtering sound. He lunged frantically toward Martha, attempting to snatch the documents right out of her hands. "These are complete lies," he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "She printed these off the internet. She is a deeply disturbed young woman trying to destroy our reputation. Do not look at those papers." But Martha pulled the packet tightly against her chest, stepping away from him with a look of profound, absolute disgust. She had already seen the undeniable digital notary stamps, the official bank headers, and the terrifyingly accurate forged signature. The other guests were shifting uncomfortably, their eyes wide with shock, as the polished, wealthy illusion of Thomas Jenkins completely disintegrated before their very eyes. I reached into my portfolio and retrieved a third packet. This one was specifically intended for Jessica. She had slowly crept toward the edge of the family room, her emerald gown shimmering in the firelight, her face a mask of total, bewildered terror. I walked directly over to her and pressed the heavy stack of papers firmly against her chest. "You called me a jealous, bitter spinster, Jessica," I said, my tone completely devoid of any sisterly warmth. "You claimed I was trying to ruin your perfect, wealthy life, but your perfect life is a complete, catastrophic illusion. Read the fourth page." Jessica looked down at the documents, her hands trembling violently. She flipped past the forged loan agreements and stared directly at the incredibly detailed background investigation report my fraud attorney had compiled. She saw the verified public court records. She saw the long, devastating list of Todd's multiple active bankruptcies in neighboring states. She saw the formal legal judgments from incredibly aggressive private lenders. She saw the absolute concrete proof that her luxury car was actively slated for repossession, and her entire existence was funded by a mountain of toxic high-interest debt. She let out a sharp, agonizing gasp, as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. She turned her head slowly, searching the crowded foyer for her husband. Todd was standing near the wet bar, his face completely ashen, his eyes wide with the realization that his entire grift had just been completely exposed to 70 of the most prominent people in the county. He took a slow, cowardly step backward, toward the kitchen hallway. My father was still shouting desperately, trying to herd the guests toward the front door, trying to aggressively shut down the party to stop the bleeding. "This is a private family matter," he bellowed, his face shining with cold sweat. "I am asking everyone to leave right now. We will handle this severe disciplinary issue internally." But the absolute destruction was not quite complete. I had one final, undeniable piece of evidence to present. I walked smoothly away from my trembling sister and approached the expensive, high-end media console resting beneath the massive flat-screen television. The professional string quartet in the dining room had completely stopped playing, entirely paralyzed by the unfolding chaos. The only sound in the house was a soft, elegant instrumental Christmas carol, playing quietly from the sophisticated wireless surround sound speakers, mounted securely in the corners of the vaulted ceiling. I pulled my cellular device from the deep hidden pocket of my crimson dress. As a professional billing analyst, I understood digital networking better than anyone in that room. I had configured my parents' entire smart home system 3 years ago, and I still possessed the master administrative credentials. With 3 rapid, precise taps on my glowing screen, I successfully hijacked the central Bluetooth receiver. The gentle classical holiday music cut off with a sharp, sudden digital click. The entire house plunged into a deep, heavy, expectant silence. The low rumbling vibration of the industrial generators outside suddenly felt incredibly loud and oppressive. I opened the audio application on my phone, located the saved voice memo from the cheap diner, and pressed the bright green play button. For a fraction of a second, there was only the soft, static hiss of background noise. Then, the unmistakable sound of clinking coffee mugs and the low hum of a busy highway diner filled the pristine, elegant living room. And then, my father's voice boomed from the expensive corner speakers, projecting with absolute crystal-clear, digital perfection. "I signed your name, Emily." The recorded voice of Thomas Jenkins echoed through the grand house, dripping with absolute arrogant certainty. "I am your father. I have every moral right to manage our family assets, to ensure everyone in this family is properly taken care of. I processed the legal proxy, and I signed the origination files because you are not using the equity anyway. It is just a minor technicality on a piece of paper." The recorded audio continued capturing his desperate, cruel demands for me to lie to the federal bank investigators. It captured his complete lack of remorse and his stunning belief that my entire existence was simply a financial resource for him to exploit. The guests stood frozen in absolute horrified silence. The wealthy churchwomen who had just been praying for my soul were staring at my father with expressions of pure, unfiltered revulsion. The country club members looked physically sickened by the blatant, unapologetic admission of federal fraud playing loudly through the premium sound system. There was absolutely no way to spin this. There was no way to claim I was crazy or unstable. Thomas had just confessed to a massive, severe felony in front of 70 unimpeachable witnesses. I disconnected the Bluetooth feed, plunging the room back into total silence. I turned slowly, facing my parents and the entire assembly of shocked guests. I stood incredibly tall, my shoulders pulled back entirely, commanding the physical and psychological space of the room. My parents stole $60,000 from me to fund a fake millionaire, I announced, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. They deliberately committed severe federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. They placed a massive unpayable lien on my modest home, intending to let it fall completely into foreclosure, just so they could keep up their pathetic suburban appearances. Barbara let out a loud, dramatic wail, collapsing heavily onto the expensive sofa, burying her face in her hands. She finally realized that her precious, flawless social reputation was completely, permanently annihilated. She would never recover from this. She would be the absolute laughingstock of her church and the ultimate pariah of her entire neighborhood. I turned my intense, unblinking gaze directly onto my father. He looked incredibly small, suddenly stripped entirely of his booming confidence and his arrogant superiority. He was just a pathetic, terrified old man standing in a freezing house powered by rented machinery he could no longer afford. "I told you yesterday that I was giving you exactly 24 hours to make a choice, Dad," I said, closing the heavy leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap. "I gave you the opportunity to sign the deed of this house over to me to fully repay the massive theft, the severe legal fees, and the profound breach of trust. I told you that was the only way I would stop the criminal investigation. You arrogantly chose to ignore me. You thought you could use this party to intimidate me into silence." I raised my hand and pointed a single, perfectly steady finger toward the massive bay windows at the front of the formal living room. "You made a catastrophic miscalculation," I told him quietly. Every single head in the room immediately turned toward the tall, frosted glass windows, cutting violently through the dark, freezing winter night, reflecting brightly off the thick blanket of fresh white snow were the rhythmic flashing colors of brilliant red and piercing blue. The silent strobing lights illuminated the grand foyer, painting my father's terrified face in alternating shades of crimson and sapphire. "I did not come here tonight to negotiate, Thomas," I said finally, using his first name, severing the absolute last remaining thread of our biological connection. "I came here to deliver my final terms. You will sign the deed over to me right now in front of these witnesses or the local police who are waiting patiently in the freezing driveway at my direct request will walk through that heavy front door and execute the active federal arrest warrants." The absolute finality of my words completely broke him. The grand illusion was entirely dead. The facade of the wealthy, successful Jenkins family had burned completely to the ground, leaving nothing but toxic ash. Thomas fell roughly to his knees on the expensive imported rug, his hands covering his face as loud, humiliating sobs finally tore through his chest. He was entirely surrendered, utterly destroyed by the consequences of his own boundless greed. Across the room, a sudden sharp clatter drew my attention. Jessica had dropped the thick packet of financial records onto the floor. She was weeping uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. She looked around the room, frantically calling out for the man who was supposed to protect her from this absolute disaster. "Todd. Todd!" She cried out, her voice cracking with sheer, desperate panic. But Todd was completely gone. The moment the brilliant red and blue police lights had begun flashing through the front windows, the fake millionaire had quickly, rapidly calculated his own severe legal exposure. Knowing he was drowning in fraudulent debt and actively wanted by multiple aggressive creditors, he had made his final cowardly move. He had silently slipped through the sliding glass patio doors at the back of the house, abandoning his golden wife without a single word, abandoning her to face the absolute catastrophic ruin entirely alone in the freezing winter night. I stood gracefully in my beautiful red dress, surrounded by the shattered ruins of my toxic family, holding my heavy leather portfolio. The roaring fire behind me cast a long, powerful shadow across the room. I had finally balanced the ledger. The debt was officially collected, and justice had been served with absolute, breathtaking precision. I walked slowly toward the front door, the heavy stilettos clicking softly, feeling the beautiful, freezing air welcome me into a completely new, completely free life. 3 months have passed since that freezing Christmas Eve, and the bitter New England winter has finally surrendered to a bright, promising spring. The heavy snow that once buried the streets has melted away completely, leaving behind fresh green grass and blooming flowers. My own life has mirrored that exact seasonal transformation. The suffocating weight of my toxic family is entirely gone, and the profound quiet of my daily routine is more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. The legal aftermath of my father's massive financial crime was swift and utterly uncompromising. Faced with the undeniable reality of a federal indictment and mandatory prison time, Thomas and Barbara Jenkins had absolutely no choice but to accept my ultimatum. 2 days after their disastrous holiday party, they walked into Mr. Sterling's downtown law office looking completely defeated and physically hollow. They sat across the glass conference table and silently signed the deed to their pristine colonial estate entirely over to me. They traded their most prized possession, their ultimate symbol of suburban superiority, for their freedom. I did not keep the house. I had absolutely no desire to live inside a museum dedicated to my own childhood misery. I immediately hired a ruthless real estate agent and placed the property on the market. Because the home was located in a highly desirable school district, it sold in less than 3 weeks for well over asking price. The moment the closing funds hit my secure bank account, I felt a physical release of tension so powerful it actually made me dizzy. I immediately paid off the fraudulent $60,000 home equity line of credit, clearing my name and completely restoring my pristine credit score. I took the remaining several $100,000 of profit and safely secured it in diversified long-term investment accounts. My financial future is now entirely bulletproof. My parents' attempt to permanently destroy my credit had ironically provided me with an impenetrable wall of lifelong financial security. Their own reality is a vastly different story. Without my paycheck to subsidize their lifestyle and without their massive house to anchor their fake wealth, Thomas and Barbara have fallen completely off the local social map. They now live in a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment on the undesirable side of town. The walls are paper thin, the carpets are stained, and the kitchen features cheap peeling linoleum instead of imported Italian marble. There are no crystal chandeliers or expensive dual ovens. There are no grand foyers for entertaining priority guests. But the absolute worst punishment for my parents is not the poverty. It is the total permanent social exile. The story of what happened on Christmas Eve spread through their affluent church congregation and the local country club like a devastating wildfire. The women who used to sip expensive wine in my mother's living room now actively cross the street to avoid making eye contact with her at the grocery store. My father was quietly asked to resign from every single community board he previously served on. The grand, immaculate reputation they committed federal fraud to protect has been permanently reduced to a shameful, whispered cautionary tale. They are completely isolated, living out their retirement years in a tiny, depressing box, entirely alone with their own bitter regrets. My older sister Jessica has also been forced to become intimately acquainted with the harsh, brutal reality of the real world. When Todd vanished out the back door of the colonial house on Christmas Eve, he never came back. He completely abandoned his golden wife, fleeing to another state to avoid his aggressive creditors and his pending civil lawsuits. He left Jessica holding a mountain of toxic consumer debt and a luxury lifestyle she had absolutely no way of maintaining. The beautiful white SUV she loved to flaunt was aggressively repossessed from her apartment parking lot in the middle of the night. She was evicted from her extravagant penthouse shortly after. The woman who spent her entire life mocking my practical clothes and my long, boring work weeks is now answering phones as a front desk receptionist at a busy corporate dental office. She spends 40 hours a week fetching coffee, scheduling root canals, and smiling politely at rude customers just to make the minimum monthly payments on her maxed-out credit cards. The golden child has been completely stripped of her artificial gold, and she is finally learning exactly how exhausting it is to actually work for a living. I do not feel sorry for any of them. I do not feel guilty. As I sit in the living room of my modest 3-bedroom starter home, drinking a warm cup of rich coffee in the gentle morning sunlight, I only feel an overwhelming sense of absolute peace. My home is safe. My finances are secure. My career at the utility company is completely thriving. I was recently promoted to a senior auditing position, recognizing the meticulous attention to detail that ultimately saved my own life. I have slowly begun to build a new life, filled with people who genuinely value my presence. I spend my weekends with incredibly kind, supportive friends who have never once asked me to fund their mistakes or fix their broken lives. I frequently meet with Mr. Sterling for lunch, viewing him not just as a brilliant attorney, but as a trusted mentor who helped me find my own unyielding strength. For the first time in 29 years, I am not tiptoeing around landmines or shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. I have come to the profound realization that cutting off a deeply toxic family member is exactly like cutting out a malignant tumor. It does not matter if that tumor shares your DNA. It does not matter how long it has been growing inside of you. If you do not surgically remove it completely and entirely, it will eventually consume your entire life. I survived the surgery, and I am finally breathing clean, fresh air. For 29 years, I honestly believed that enduring constant disrespect was simply the mandatory price of admission for a family's love. I thought that if I just worked a little harder, gave a little more money, and made myself a little smaller, they would eventually recognize my inherent value. I believed the incredibly toxic lie that being a good daughter meant allowing myself to be endlessly consumed by their bottomless greed. I learned the absolute hardest way possible, that true family does not operate in the shadows. True family does not forge your signature on legal documents to steal the roof over your head. True family does not sit around a formal dining room table, sipping expensive wine while actively plotting your total financial ruin. And most importantly, true family will never demand that you set yourself on fire just to keep them comfortably warm. The incredible peace I feel today did not come from a sudden magical reconciliation. It did not come from waiting patiently for toxic people to miraculously change their fundamental nature. It came from finally recognizing my own unshakable worth and refusing to allow anyone to treat me like a disposable asset ever again. Setting strict, immovable boundaries is never a betrayal of your family. Boundaries are your personal armor. They are the essential protective walls you must build to keep your mind, your heart, and your future entirely safe from people who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. It is a terrifying, difficult process to sever the ties with the people who raised you, but the profound freedom waiting on the other side is worth every single moment of the struggle. I want to know about your own journey. Have you ever had to draw a difficult, hard line with your family to protect your own future? Have you ever reached that absolute breaking point where you finally had to stop being the bigger person and simply let the chips fall exactly where they may? Please let me know your story in the comments below, because sharing our experiences is how we remind each other that we are never alone in this fight. If my story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue building this supportive community together. I always love knowing where my words are reaching, so please tell me exactly where you are watching from and what time it is right now in your part of the world. Your engagement helps these vital stories reach the people who might be sitting in the dark right now, desperately needing the courage to finally walk away. Until next time, remember that your life belongs entirely to you. You are absolutely worthy of respect, and you always deserve a permanent, honored seat at your own table. Take care of yourself.